Chapter 151. Klein's request. The chirping of insects and the hooting of owls reverberated along the path back to the small town. Isaac looked ahead and said after a few seconds of silence, "Even though I'm not entirely sure what happened to me, I do have a rough idea. Perhaps I'm someone who has lived for a very, very long time. Mr. Isaac, you have to seriously consider if you still fit the definition of someone." Klein thought to himself, but he didn't dare to say it out loud. This wilderness, this silence, often makes one weak. I should have paid some sort of price in exchange for this long life. I've lived since the end of the fourth epoch, like a wandering spirit across the continent. Isaac's voice deepened, as if he was trying to suppress his emotions. I don't remember the past. I've forgotten about the people and things that I've sworn to remember. Klein poked at the weeds in front of him and said, in thought, "Mr. Isaac, I have a theory regarding your situation." "What theory?" Isaac looked to the side. "I think that there's a cycle to your memory loss. Perhaps you die once every few decades, and your memories of the events before that vanishes. Then, after some time, you wake up from the darkness of your slumber and begin on a new phase of life. This way, we can explain why you would have such varied dreams. Those are events that you came across over your several lives." Klein described his theory. Isaac slowed down his pace, as if the darkness had grabbed onto his sleeve. He looked ahead with a turbid look before saying after a while, "That is consistent with the memories that were jolted awake just now." Memories that were jolted awake? Klein had an idea as he said immediately, "Mr. Isaac, you might not have to leave Tingen to search for your lost past. You'll regain your memories slowly." "Why?" Isaac turned his head in surprise. Klein smiled and said, "Your memories aren't completely gone. The parts of your memory that jolted awake just now are proof of that. Furthermore, do you remember the moment you woke up in Backlund and discovered that you had forgotten all about the past?" Isaac nodded. "That's a nightmare that bothers me till this day." Klein tapped downwards with his black cane and explained in detail, "Before today, I didn't think that there was a problem with that. But your description just now, together with my own conjecture, makes it feel a little weird. You had a document of identification and enough money when you woke up from your dream. You also appeared in a way that didn't startle anyone. All of that seems like it was arranged for you, allowing you to fit into society with little effort. Then, who made the arrangements? There is only one answer: the you from the past. The past you regained his memories and knew that you would have to usher in a new life. Thus, he prepared everything for you, trying his best to not let you attract suspicion from anyone else." Isaac stopped walking. He looked at the specks of light coming from the town, once again slipped into silence. "Perhaps the parents that I've been searching for were the past me all along," he sighed, admitting that Klein's deduction was very plausible. "Thus, you don't need to do anything. All you have to do is patiently wait for your memories to come back to you," Klein concluded and consoled Mr. Isaac. Isaac subconsciously waved his cane before he turned still, like a sculpture carved out of marble. After a long time, he looked into the distance and answered, Perhaps I'll only fully regain my memory when this life is nearing its end. I don't want to wait that long. I want to have plenty of time to understand and free myself from this destiny. So I have to be more proactive in searching for my past, to trigger my memories a little at a time. I have to get back my memories back before the time you hypothesized. Waiting would only make me repeat the cycle. Indeed, that's the choice worth looking forward to the most." Klein didn't advise against it. Instead, he asked, "Mr. Isaac, may I ask for your help in something trivial, other than finding the criminal that took the skull of your child and made my fate disharmonious?" Isaac nodded slightly. "What do you need me to do?" Klein organized his words and said, "I hope that you can head to a town between 2 and 5 hours away from Tingen by carriage next week, or the week after. I need you to cause a paranormal incident, something that wouldn't harm anyone. Judging from how you tried to search for the criminal using your bloodline's connection, I would think that you are fairly adept in the field of dead souls." "No problem," Isaac promised without any hesitation. He didn't ask Klein why he wanted him to do something like that. At the same time, he had tacitly confirmed Klein's conjecture about his powers. "Thank you. This is very important to me. Also, You can only choose a follower of the Evernight goddess when you are picking a target. Also, don't leave any clues behind, Klein instructed. Only through this method could the incident be relayed to the Tinjin Nighthawks. Only then could he join the team on the mission and suggest using sealed artifact 3-0782. Only then could he extract the divine blood from the sealed artifact to create flaring sun charms. That was the most powerful item he could obtain at the moment. Under the assumption that the culprit living in the house with the red chimney hasn't left Tinjin, and that Klein was going to continue investigating, he had to try his best to become more powerful. Yes, according to the information I obtained, stealing a little of its powers wouldn't damage 3-0782. At the very most, it would only lessen the amount of time it takes to purify. This is for the safety and stability of Tinjin City. Klein inwardly tried to justify his actions. Azik didn't care about his motives. He nodded. I will tell you the name of the town and the estimated time beforehand so you can prepare yourself. Phew. Klein heaved a sigh of relief. He felt that this trip to Lamed Town wasn't a wasted trip. Even though they only managed to peel back the outermost layer of the mysteries surrounding Mr. Azik and had much more to find out, he had at least managed to gain the friendship of Azik, a reliable ally in his search for the culprit behind the scenes. At 11:30 that night, Klein returned to 2 Daffodil Street, hungry and tired. To think that Mr. Azik didn't treat me to dinner. He wouldn't have been in the mood to enjoy dinner anyway, Klein muttered as he opened the door. The house wasn't as dark as he had anticipated. An elegant gas lamp was silently emitting its light, warmly illuminating the living room. Benson was sitting alone on the sofa with a book, draped under a bright coat. When he saw the door open, Benson was just about to speak when he yawned. He had no choice but to cover his mouth. Klein closed the door and smiled, quipping, I went to Lamed Town with Mr. Azik. There's an abandoned castle with a long history over there. Benson was immediately enlightened as he laughed. A moonless night, a castle abandoned for a millennia, a cold and creepy environment, coupled with a 2-man archaeological team. This is the perfect recipe for the opening of a paranormal novel. What happened today could be classified as paranormal. Klein suddenly recalled the strange door Mr. Azik conjured and the cries of a baby. He said, a lingering fear still gripping onto him, it did feel a bit like that back there. Benson yawned again before shutting his book and said, I need sleep. Ever since I began studying and reading classical literature, the quality of my sleep has become especially good. Klein laughed to himself, suddenly recalling something Miss Justice had mentioned. He said, lowering his voice, Benson, you know that my company has connections with the Alwa County Police. I recently heard news from Backlund that the king, prime minister, other ministers and members of parliament are all sick of an inefficient government. They want to push for a reform and select talents to take on positions in the government based on an open examination, just like the entrance examinations of universities. Benson was at a loss at first, then his eyes sparkled as he asked, an open examination? Yes. As long as you pass the examination, you could become a civil servant in one of the branches of the government. My guess is that the contents of the examination will be modeled after the entrance exams of the universities. Literature, the classics, math and logic, as well as a basic understanding of the law. Klein used this opportunity to include his opinion. He continued, Benson, this must be kept confidential, and don't put too much hope on this. No one knows if this will be passed by the House of Lords and House of Commons or not. I'll keep it in mind. I understand that all I need to do is study hard. Benson smiled, then said, I'd study hard whether this change happens or not. I'll try my best to free myself from my current circumstance and find a better job. Learning, that's the greatest difference between a human and a curly-haired baboon. No, research suggests that baboons have decent IQ levels and a certain level of learning abilities. Klein lampooned silently and looked on as Benson headed to the second floor. After that, he smiled and rubbed his stomach as he walked toward the kitchen. He found the leftovers and the chicken Benson and Melissa left him especially. Klein relaxed as he started preparing his late dinner. It was deep into the night now, and most people had already gone to bed. He was the only one still awake, breathing in the cool air with mixed aromas and making slight movements. Everything was peaceful and serene. After he was satiated, he washed the dishes and took a bath. Finally, Klein returned to his room and locked the door. He yawned but kept himself awake. He took out the silver dagger used for rituals and sealed the room with a wall of spirituality. He wanted to divine above the gray fog whether summoning the fool that doesn't belong to this era was dangerous or not. Chapter 152. Nice attempt. The gray fog filled the air in its eternally unchanging manner as the illusory crimson stars hung around him at varying distances. Klein sat inside the lofty palace that looked like the home of a giant as he looked at the familiar sight before him. After a few seconds, he looked away and made a yellowish-brown goatskin appear before him. Then, he lifted a pen to write his amended incantation for the summoning ritual. Light a candle to represent myself. Use a spiritual wall to create a holy environment. Drip a drop of full moon essence oil in the flame, chamomile pure dew, slumber flower powder, and other ingredients. Note, there's no need to be too particular in this step because it's summoning oneself. Recite the incantation below. In ancient Hermes, Jotun, Dragonese, or Elfish. It must be a deep shout. I summon in my name, Hermes, the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good lucks. After scrutinizing it 3 times, Klein wrote a divination statement at the bottom. There will be danger if the ritual above is carried out outside of this world. Phew. He let out a breath, put down the pen, took out the silver chain in his sleeve, and held it with his left hand. The topaz pendant hung above the goatskin steadily, only a slight distance above the divination statement. He reined in his thoughts and entered a cogitation state. There will be danger if the ritual above is carried out outside of this world. There will be danger if the ritual above is carried out outside of this world. After reciting the statement 7 times, Klein opened his eyes, which were almost all black, and looked at the topaz pendant which was spinning counterclockwise. That meant a negative outcome. There would be no danger. I can give it a try then. Klein made the items before him disappear. He then extended his spirituality to wrap around himself and simulated the sensation of falling. When he returned to his bedroom, due to the fact that he had sealed the entire room with a spiritual wall, Klein immediately cleared his desk and put out a mint-scented candle right in the middle. He pressed slightly on the candle wick, rubbing it with spirituality to cause friction and ignite the candle. Under the flickering dim light, Klein dripped the corresponding essential oils, extracts, and herb powder onto the flame. A soothing fragrance suddenly filled the air, and the room alternated between brightness and darkness. Taking 2 steps back, Klein looked at the candle that represented himself and shouted in Jotun. Then he switched to Hermes. I summon in my name, the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Just as he finished speaking, he sensed the wavering candlelight suddenly dance vigorously and produce a vortex with the surrounding fragrance. It absorbed his spirituality at an insane rate. Slumberflower, a herb that belongs to the red moon, please bestow your powers to my incantation. Klein endured the discomfort brought about from having his spirituality drained as he finished reciting the incantation. Then he saw the candlelight stop wavering. It was tainted with a gray luster, which extended to about the size of a palm. I didn't summon anything. Oh right, perhaps I'll need to respond to it above the gray fog? It's really quite troublesome to summon myself, Klein muttered, pinching his aching forehead. He calmed himself down, then took 4 steps counterclockwise before arriving above the gray fog again. He saw that there was a rippling light above the seat of honor at the ancient table. It stemmed from the strange symbol at the back of the corresponding chair. The strange symbol that was made up of a pupilless eye, a symbol representing secrecy, and contorted lines that represented change. All Klein did was extend his hand to reach for it when he immediately heard, I summon in my name, the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Then he saw surging spirituality combined with a rippling light that formed into an illusory yet shapeless door. The door shook as though it wanted to be opened. Klein immediately felt inspired and strongly willed for it to be pushed open. Almost instantly, the boundless fog and lofty palace was drawn forward. There were a few barely noticeable ripples. The ripples surged towards the illusory yet shapeless door. But, no matter how much Klein pushed it, the door couldn't be pushed open. Every movement resulted in dead silence. The door of summoning has yet to take shape? Klein reined in his will and creased his eyebrows when he analyzed the reason why he had failed. He had casually named the door of summoning. I'm lacking spirituality, so I can't form a complete door of summoning. When I advance to sequence 8 clown and pass through the initial dangerous stage, I can give it another try. Maybe it won't be a problem by then. Klein nodded lightly and roughly understood what had happened. This experiment gave him a confidence boost. He felt heartened as this was the first time that he received some sort of response from the mysterious space above the gray fog, other than the incident where he divined about eternal blazing sun. There will come a day when I'll understand all the secrets here, Klein excitedly declared in his heart. He then made a rapid descent into the boundless fog after he wrapped himself up with spirituality. Klein quickly blew out the candle after he returned to his bedroom. He ended the ritual and cleaned up his study desk before he removed the spiritual wall. A gust of wind suddenly blew as he yawned. He collapsed into the bed, covered himself with a blanket and quickly fell asleep. In the hazy dream that followed, Klein woke up abruptly and realized that he was sitting in the living room of his home and was holding the Tianjin City Honest paper. Don't tell me Captain is here again? He was stunned at first as he looked outside the oriel window, finding humor in his exasperation. With a creak, the door opened. Dunn walked in slowly, wearing his black windbreaker that went beyond his knees and held a cane and pipe. He was still wearing his black top hat, and underneath it were his profound gray eyes. Dunn came to the living room and sat on the single-seat sofa. He leisurely crossed his right leg over his left. He put aside his cane, took off his hat, and leaned backwards. He sat there quietly and looked at Klein as though he was thinking. Captain, what are you trying to do today? Klein was dumbfounded. In order to not expose that he knew that it was a dream, he pretended to not be affected by it and continued to read the newspaper. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. He lifted his head to look at Dunn, who sat opposite him. He found out that the captain was still sitting there quietly and was looking at him in deep thought. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Klein flipped through the newspaper back and forth multiple times, looking at Dunn from the corner of his eyes, and noticed that the man was still looking at him quietly in deep thought. Captain, you're making me very uncomfortable. Klein couldn't sit in peace. He folded the newspaper and put it aside. He nodded and smiled at Dunn. Then, he went to the kitchen to get a piece of cloth and started wiping the dining table and coffee table. Captain, look, my dream is so simple, so ordinary, so boring. There's nothing worth observing. Hurry up and leave. Why don't you pretend to be a ghost and I'll pretend to be frightened, then you can complete your achievement as a nightmare. He prayed in silence and lifted his head, but all he saw was Dunn's deep gray eyes that were still in deep thought. Under such a quiet and constant gaze, Klein wiped all the furniture and cleaned his room. He was so exhausted in his dream. What wore him out the most was Dunn Smith, who was watching him quietly in deep thought. Klein had no idea how much time had passed while he made himself busy until he finally saw his captain uncross his legs and stand up. Then he took his cane, put on his hat, and walked through the door. Klein held his breath and watched Dunn leave his house. He couldn't help but lift his right hand to wave goodbye. Phew. When everything returned to normal, Klein let out a breath of relief. That really was such a nightmare. He thought to himself, too preoccupied for tears. Backlund, West Backlund, Phillips Department Store. Phillips was one of the top-end department stores in the Lone Kingdom. It only opened to nobles and wealthy people who were qualified to be members. There was always luxurious carriages parked outside with different emblems printed on them. Not only was it a safe place for shopping, it also became a popular social venue due to the strict restriction on members. Audrey brought her maidservant, Annie, and her golden retriever, Susie. Under the ushering of an eagerly attentive attendant, she got off the carriage and walked through the entrance. Along the way, She saw daughters of viscounts, countesses, or maidens with parents of high social status. She maintained her elegance and greeted them all gracefully. She communicated with different nobles on different topics. For instance, when she faced a particular countess, she would compliment the fittings of the countess's dress, and when she greeted a particular baroness, she would praise the outstanding performance of the baroness's husband in the House of Lords. Audrey hadn't been good at that previously. She was too stubborn and too arrogant. But now, she didn't even need to put in much effort to respond perfectly. In a spectator's eyes, most of the emotions and thoughts of the female nobles were written on their faces. Arriving at the second floor, Audrey turned into a shop that sold ready-made dresses. The attendant in the shop was a petite maiden. She wore a black and white dress and had shoulder-length blonde hair. She was the arbiter, Zio Dericha. Audrey gave Susie a look without changing her facial expression. The dog understood what her owner meant immediately and ran to another counter. Maidservant Annie went after Susie to try to drag her back. "Well done." Audrey complimented inwardly and walked next to Zio Dericha, pretending to look at the variety of dresses. "Why did you arrange to meet me here for?" Zio inquired with a whisper while she loudly introduced the dresses. Her voice was tender, just like a child's. "Where's the original attendant?" Audrey asked in reply instead of answering her. Zio looked around and said, "I convinced her." She was happy to rest for the morning. Audrey looked at the different style dresses while she took out a piece of neatly folded paper from her lamb leather handbag and secretly passed it to Zio. "Rear Admiral Hurricane, Kalangos, has snuck into Backlund. This is his portrait. I hope you can find him for me. Oh, and don't alert him." Zio received the piece of paper and unfolded it to take a quick glance. She saw that it was a lifelike portrait of a man in his 30s that had a unique broad chin. "I was once constantly praised by my art teacher." Audrey stole a glance at Zio and lifted her head. She added, "The kingdom offers a reward of £10,000 for Kalangos. If he were to be arrested, even the person that only provided clues would definitely be awarded with a few £100. Just as she finished her sentence, she saw Zio's eyes beam with joy, as she had expected. Chapter 153, Final Act of Laying the Foundation. A unique wide jaw. His hair is in a bun like an ancient knight's, eyes that look at you with the intent of an icy smile. Zio Dericha was half slumped on the sofa as she scrutinized the portrait that Audrey had handed to her. In her eyes, the man might as well have been a living, walking pile of money. After committing the looks of the great pirate Kalangos to her memory, she proceeded to read the description written at the bottom of the page: brown hair, dark green eyes. The portrait can only be used as a general reference as the target possesses the ability to transform into another person. It is unknown how long he can maintain the transformation. The portrait can only be used as a reference. The target possesses the ability to transform into another person. Only as a reference, transform into another person? Then why did I spend so much time memorizing his facial features? Zio wore a dazed look, as if it was the first time she had witnessed the evil intentions the world had for her. She looked up and saw Fur's Wall slumped languidly in a sofa across from her. She seemed to be muttering to herself, "There's no way to look for this person. We don't know what he looks like. All we know is that he's not from Backlund. There are far too many foreigners who come into Backlund every day." Furs attempted to sit up, but failed even after 3 tries. "I'm only an apprentice, not an arbiter," she pouted as she placed her hand on the armrest of the sofa, successfully pulling herself up into a sitting position. "Does that lady think that we are prophets?" Furs jested. Zio was about to answer when she realized that there were still footnotes she hadn't gone through yet. She recited them out softly. The suggested ways of searching are as follows. 1. Kalangos has an evil object with him. It needs to devour the flesh, blood, and soul of a living person every other day. You can consider looking for missing vagrants. 2. Search for Kalangos' information thoroughly and build a profile of his unique hobbies and behaviors. 3. A person's facial features might change, but as long as he hasn't received any special training, he will often act like himself, such as the things he prefers to eat, his gait, actions he's used to performing, and many other details. Furs nodded as she listened. Miss Audrey isn't the innocent, naive teen that the rumors about her suggest. She has a meticulous heart and a calm sense of observation. Is that so? Zio asked, doubtful. She didn't expect an answer as she changed the topic by suggesting, I'll be in charge of gathering the information. Can you consolidate that pile of gold pounds? No, that Admiral's hobbies and unique traits? Furs opened her eyes wide open and shook the steel box containing her cigarettes. How can you bear to do this? How can you bear to make a dainty, sensitive author do consolidation, analysis, and deduction? Zio shot her good friend a glance as she exuded an air of authority without realizing it. There's an interesting paragraph on deduction in your Stormwind Mountain villa. Furs pulled her shoulders back and lowered her head. She looked at the coffee table as she said, Do you know how much of my hair I pulled out, how much sleep I lost, just for that paragraph? She quickly lifted her head and looked at Zio Cha, then lowered her head once again and grumbled, Life is short. There are too many things that we need to do. Why must we waste our time on such uninteresting, menial tasks? That's very reasonable. Zio nearly nodded in agreement. She fought hard to keep her authority as an arbiter. Then do you have any other ways to solve this problem? She suppressed her voice, making her childlike voice sound deeper. Furs thought for nearly 20 seconds before looking up suddenly. We can hire a professional. After you finish collecting information on Rear Admiral Hurricane, we shall erase the name and hand it over to an excellent detective, then ask him to do the consolidation and deduction. All we have to do is pay a fee. Why didn't I think of that? Zio's mind went blank. Furs and Zio looked at each other without saying anything. When the atmosphere became awkward, she cleared her throat. We'll do it according to your suggestion. After saying this, she quickly added, You'll pay the fee. House Street, Divination Club. Good afternoon, Mr. Moretti. The pretty receptionist Angelica looked at Klein in surprise. You rarely come on Fridays. Exhausted from searching for the house with the red chimney, Klein smiled and said, Fate never repeats itself indefinitely. It always brings us some surprises. He was in the area, and the time had expired on the carriage he rented, thus, he came for a cup of black tea and some rest. Furthermore, this would serve as the final layer of the foundations. With the new experience at the Divination Club, he would logically mention the application to Dunn Smith. Your words are always so philosophical, Angelica praised. Klein thought for a moment before saying with deliberation, I might not come to the Divination Club too often in the future, so you need not recommend me to others anymore. He had already digested his potion, so he had to advance towards a new goal. Why? Angelica said in shock and puzzlement. You've already made a name for yourself in the club. Most people know that your divinations are very accurate and miraculous. In fact, we were considering getting you to come in on Sundays as a lecturer. If I was paid £1 for every divination I perform, then I would keep doing this regardless of how tired I was. Besides, I still have to investigate the houses with red chimneys and find the culprit as soon as possible. Klein smiled warmly. Madam, do not convince me to stay. This is the arrangement of fate. I won't stop coming to the Divination Club entirely, it's just that my visits will become less frequent. I'll still pay the membership fees on time. I can get reimbursed for it anyway. I will come down occasionally to monitor the place. Klein added in his heart. How regretful. I hope that you will be at the club when I happen to be lost. Angelica sighed. She realized that this wasn't as surprising as she imagined after the initial shock had passed. Perhaps such a miraculous seer that still respected fate wasn't someone who could be held back by a club in Tingen. Angelica smiled as if thinking about something. Sigh black tea? Yes. Klein returned a smile. He spent about 20 minutes in the club, spending the time resting, finishing his black tea before leaving the club. He took a public carriage back to Daffodil Street. When he entered, he opened the mailbox out of habit and saw that there was a letter placed inside not too long ago. Klein opened the letter and noticed that it was from Mr. Azik. I will be heading to Morristown on Sunday and return on Wednesday. Most of the citizens in Morristown are believers of the goddess. He's heading there on a Sunday, which means that according to the usual level of efficiency, the Nighthawks would only receive the information on Tuesday or Wednesday. I can make it? To think that Mr. Azik would remember my request? I hope that he remembers not to do it personally. Him summoning a spirit and doing something scary would suffice. Klein nodded slightly. He released his spirituality and burned the letter with friction. He flicked his hand, turning the flames into ashes, and allowed them to fall slowly onto the ground. Saturday afternoon. Klein was wearing his black windbreaker and hat. He had his cane in his hand as he walked slowly into the Blackthorn Security Company. After greeting Roseanne, he looked at the partition and noticed that the captain's office was open. He deliberately spoke louder. Yesterday, I saw a girl who looked just like you at the divination club. Really? Roseanne asked, her interest piqued. Klein nodded without sincerity. Yes, in fact, I thought that she was your sister. I'm sorry to have to disappoint you, but I have no sisters, not even cousins. Roseanne laughed. Do you remember her name? No, why would I remember her name? Klein smiled. Looking at her was exactly like looking at you. Can I take that as a compliment? Roseanne was a chatty girl who never needed others to start the conversation. She asked on her own accord, Klein, I would assume that you're earning quite a bit from the divination club? As a true seer, your abilities are far beyond those who take this as a hobby. We would still be good colleagues if you didn't mention this. Klein coughed. A seer has to be respectful of fate. We cannot use divination to ask for abnormal privileges. Are you concluding your own maxim for a seer? Roseanne asked out of curiosity. Yes, Klein answered frankly. After a brief chat, Klein said goodbye to Roseanne. He took his hat and walked toward the partition. He looked at Dunn Smith, who was drinking his coffee, as he knocked on the open door. Please come in. Dunn looked up at Klein and adjusted his posture immediately. Klein had already probed the captain over the past 2 days. He confirmed that Dunn Smith hadn't mentioned the acting method as he was trying it out. It was clear that he was also cautious of the higher-ups of the church. Thus he closed the door and sat across from Dunn. He said with a serious, yet slightly excited expression, Captain, I believe that I have completely grasped the seer potion. I wish to submit a special application. Chapter 154. Sharing experience. As he looked into Klein's eyes, Dunn took a deep breath and leaned back. Then he slowly exhaled as he spoke. Are you certain? There were minor changes in his facial expression. He seemed to be well prepared for the special application, but he hadn't expected it to be so soon. Captain, why do you look relieved? Klein didn't conceal his smile as he said, I'm certain, Captain. When you fully master a potion, you'll feel a very special and magical sensation. You'll have no doubt that you've fully mastered the potion. Special, magical feeling. Dunn muttered those words softly and his eyebrows slowly knitted together. Huh, the captain advanced twice without fully digesting the potion? Of course, if he didn't know about that acting method, it would be difficult to fully digest it. He must have used a prolonged period of time to break it down and was subconsciously acting to minimize the risk of losing control. Poor captain. Klein quietly looked at Dunn Smith, but he didn't speak or say anything further so as to allow Dunn to think carefully. After almost a minute, Dunn's deep eyes reflected Klein's figure once again. He weighed his words before he said, maybe it would be a better option to wait another year. What the captain means is that waiting another year would make it less conspicuous. With the example that Madame Daly set for me, the higher-ups wouldn't pay too much attention to me. At most, I would only be put on a list for observation, Klein thought and answered frankly. At first, I wanted to wait until next year to send in my special application. After all, there are too many things that I need to master. For instance, my combat arts is only at the beginner level. But, Captain, don't you think that we've experienced too many coincidences in the last 2 months? We were chasing after the kidnappers when we came across the Antigonus notebook in the opposite room. The shipment of sealed artifact 2-049 was delayed, but Ray Bieber didn't leave Tingen and tried to digest the power at the harbor. I went to attend a birthday banquet and triggered Han S. Vincent's incident. I went to investigate at the library and ran into a member of the Aurora Order. I don't know what these coincidences mean, but I feel insecure. That's why I want to enhance myself in the best possible way. Klein seized the opportunity to talk about the manipulator behind the scenes. It was something he had planned to include in his schedule. Without exposing his uniqueness, he would remind the Nighthawks to make them search for more clues from different angles. What he said earlier would only lead the other Nighthawks to conclude that Klein had a discerning mind and was good at organizing his thoughts. The moment Klein said the word "but," Dunn's body leaned forward. In the end, he steepled his fingers in front of his mouth. He fixed his gaze and remained quiet, seemingly thinking about what Klein had said. After a while, Dunn lifted his head and said in a mellow and deep voice, "Very perceptive. Perhaps there really is something lurking in the dark." Without waiting for Klein to speak, he instructed, "You can submit the special application." "All right." Klein lifted the corner of his lips when he answered. He got up with a smile and walked towards the door. As expected, he heard a familiar additional remark. "Hold on," Dunn called out. He weighed his words and said, "Take note of your choice of words. Don't worry, Captain. I place a far greater importance on this matter than you do." Klein nodded in agreement with a smile. At first, he thought Dunn would propose that they avoid going through the Holy Cathedral and instead advance to Sequence 8 in secret. Then they could go through the normal procedure after 3 years. However, after he thought it through, he realized that it was impossible. Regardless of whether it was through a special application or a normal application, the person who was going to advance still had to be investigated by the Holy Cathedral. The only difference was that one method was relatively simple and the other was more complicated. If he had become a Sequence 8 in secret, then it could put the entire Tinjin Nighthawks in trouble. Since Klein was finished with his mysticism lessons, he didn't go to the basement in a hurry but walked to the clerk's office next door after leaving the captain's office. He found a man and a woman sitting in the office. The man was in his 30s and the woman was in her 20s. They were the two newly added members. They were surprised when Klein entered, then they smiled and nodded in greeting. They were curious and in awe of the Beyonders that they worked with. Klein didn't chat with them but found an empty desk and began writing a draft for the special application. As he already had a draft in his head, it only took about 10 minutes to complete his initial work. After reading it a couple of times and amending parts of it, he sat before the Ackerson Model 1346 typewriter and started typing his draft onto a document. Listening to the tapping of the keyboard, the two new clerks exchanged looks and stood up simultaneously. They left the office and went to the reception hall to chat with Rosen, allowing Klein to have some privacy. Very careful and fully aware of the need to maintain secrecy, Klein stole a glance at their receding figures as he complimented them. He focused on his work again and continued tapping on the typewriter. Just as he was going to complete his special application, Leonard Mitchell came out of the restroom. He looked around while he buttoned his shirt. There was an unrestrained beauty in his messy hair. "What's the report you're writing?" Leonard looked around the clerk's office as he leaned against the door frame with his right foot tiptoed to balance himself and his hands tucked into his pockets. His green eyes examined Klein with interest. Klein typed the last word and the last punctuation mark. He then turned his head and smiled. "Special application." "Special application?" Leonard asked, puzzled. Klein picked up the paper and skimmed through it quickly. He casually explained, "A special application to advance to Sequence 8. Leonard suddenly coughed vigorously. He calmed down and asked, "Digest? Bro, you know quite a bit?" Klein held his special application and walked before Leonard. He lifted an eyebrow and said, "Yes." Then he looked into his eyes and added softly with a chuckle, "I remember someone told me once that there are some people who are special, people who can do things that others can't. Such as me. Such as you." Leonard was suddenly at a loss for words. He could only change his standing posture and take his hands out his pockets to cross them in front of his chest. He opened his mouth and finally organized his words. He asked in a low voice, "Don't you think that it's too risky?" As he already knew about digesting, he definitely understands that my advancement has no risk of losing control. Is he referring to the attention from the higher-ups in the church? Klein explained while in thought. "Leonard, do you remember the first task that we worked on together? We were merely tracking kidnappers, but we realized that the room opposite had clues about the Antigonus family's notebook. He repeated what he mentioned to Dunn once more. Leonard's expression grew heavy, and he nodded in agreement slightly. He muttered to himself and said, "Maybe I have to hurry up." Just as he finished, he suddenly looked at Klein and flashed a smile as he said, "Aren't you going to share your experience with us? The experience to quickly grasp a potion and avoid the risk of losing control. This guy sure can put on a facade quickly." Klein smiled and answered, "I'm more than willing to." He was planning to seize the opportunity today to remind his Nighthawk teammates on how to minimize the risk of losing control. Of course, to maintain his personal safety, he couldn't say it as straightforwardly as he did to Dunn Smith. At most, he could describe the idea vaguely, in a way that wouldn't alert anyone who was sent down by the higher-ups. "Let's do it now then." Leonard impatiently dragged Klein to the Nighthawk's recreation room. At that very moment, other than Royale, who was taking her shift at Cheney's Gate, Fry, Kenley, and Sikatron were there playing cards. Everyone. Leonard knocked on the half-closed door and spoke as if he was reciting a poem. "Let me introduce this man next to me, Mr. Klein Moretti, who has fully grasped his potion in a month and a half." This guy is so dramatic. Klein suddenly felt awkward. What? Even Sikatron, the author who wasn't famous and barely sold any books, cocked her head sideways as though she was testing her hearing ability. "Leonard, don't joke around. You're always exaggerating things." Kenley covered his cards helplessly. Fry held his cards as he looked at Klein. He kept quiet for a while and said, "Are you sure that you've already fully grasped the potion?" "Yes." Klein could feel his concern and he nodded confidently. There was an obvious indication. "What? Really?" Kenley shouted a delayed response and stood up. Leonard chuckled and pointed at the paper in Klein's hands as he said, "This is the special application that he's going to hand in. The special application to advance to Sequence 8. How did you do it?" Sikatron had many questions, but she only voiced the one that concerned her the most after taking a deep breath. She was normally quiet and elegant, but now she had a burning passion in her eyes that couldn't be suppressed. Klein found a chair and sat down. He lowered his voice and answered, "I found inspiration from the maxim of the Mystery Priors. Do as you wish, but do no harm?" Leonard supplemented, "Yes. According to our confidential information, following this maxim gives the Mystery Priors a lower probability of losing control." Klein explained what he learned from old Neil. "After that, Madame Daly's example gave me a better understanding of the process." "Spirit Medium Daly?" Kenley asked in reply, hoping to gain confirmation. "Yes. Madame Daly has handed in a special application before. She only used 2 years to become a spirit medium from Corpse Collector. She once told old Neil that she wanted to be a real spirit medium," Klein explained in detail. "With the experience I gained in the Divination Club and corresponding feedback that I've received, I gradually concluded my seer principles. Then I followed it strictly and tried to become a real seer. When I did so, I realized that the speed at which I grasped the potion became faster." As they listened to Klein's recount, Fry, Sika, and the rest fell into deep thought. Even Leonard pretended to be thinking. "I'm going to hand in my special application." Klein waved the paper in his hands. "If you have any problems, do ask me privately." "All right," Fry replied coldly with a nod. Klein left the recreation room and knocked on the door to the captain's office again. He sat down opposite to Dunn, then took up a pen and ink pad. He signed and stamped his thumbprint. "Captain, this is my special application." After that, he passed the paper to Dunn with both hands. Dunn looked through it carefully and put down the application. "I'll submit it to the Holy Cathedral as soon as possible. You should be prepared to be examined. Perhaps next week or the following week." "All right." Klein took a deep breath and nodded seriously. He stood up, exited the captain's office, and closed the door behind him. During the process, he thought about the application that he had sent in. There was a thought that popped up in his head. "I wonder what kind of examination it will be." Chapter 155. Urgent meeting. After collecting himself, Klein went down to the basement and walked to Cheney's Gate. He knocked on the door to the guard room. Inside, Royale Radine had already packed her personal belongings. She immediately smoothed her hair and stood up when she saw the person taking over her shift. After greeting each other with a nod, Klein suddenly said, "I've had some success with grasping my potion and have shared my experiences with Fry and the rest. You can ask them about it." Royale, who typically didn't have much of an expression, looked at Klein with a little shock. Her lips quivered a little as she said, "All right, madam, let's hope that you can still maintain your calm composure in a while. There are already a bunch of dazed people sitting in the recreation room right now." Klein laughed and made his way behind the table, expertly taking out the tin can which Dunsmith used to store his Fermo coffee. After making himself a cup of aromatic coffee, Klein sat down and relaxed. He looked out at the lonely hallway and allowed his thoughts to roam free. Let's hope that Mr. Azek's mission is successful and that he doesn't leave behind any clues. Well, even if there are clues, I can just pretend to not notice them. I wonder where the mutated sun's sacred emblem is sealed behind Cheney's gate? Since it doesn't possess any living qualities, it only needs a little space. Come to think of it, I haven't been inside Cheney's gate. I'm not sure what it looks like inside. To be able to keep the weird sealed artifacts of varying sizes safe and maintain surveillance, it must be quite special indeed. For example, the ashes of Saint Selena? Many thoughts streaked past Klein's head when he suddenly heard urgent footsteps. He focused and shot a look towards the door. He saw old Neil, wearing his classic black robe, appear in the corridor with a black carpet in his hands. He made his way into the guard room and said nothing, but instead observed Klein thoroughly. "Mr. Neil, did something happen?" Klein let out a dry chuckle and took a sip of his fragrant coffee. Old Neil sized him up and sighed. "To think that you would find inspiration from the maxim of the mystery priors and daily, I have to praise the goddess. I also have to thank you for your teachings." Klein gave a reply in all seriousness. Old Neil pulled back a chair and sat down. He said, a little depressed, "How good would it be if it was 20 years ago?" Klein maintained his silence, for he knew that old Neil wasn't allowed to consume any more potions because of his age and health, even if he had completely digested the one he had right now. Under such circumstances, anything he said would have agitated him. "My earliest thoughts was to quickly gain control of my potion from the maxim of the mystery prior, but regrettably, I wasn't embarking in the right direction. Daly's success did give me some clues, but I was already more than 50 years old back then, and had already given up on my efforts. I subconsciously thought that her success was a result of her genius, and that an average person wouldn't be able to emulate her achievements." Old Neil rubbed his temples as he described his disappointment. He was silent for a few minutes before he lifted his head. He looked at Klein. "It sure is regrettable that only now do I understand what I've missed out on at this age." Old Neil should have had a faint understanding of that acting method. He immediately understood what happened after I shared my experiences. Klein consoled, "It wouldn't have made too much of a difference. The church doesn't hold the sequence 8 corresponding to Mystery Prior. Perhaps the Holy Cathedral does have it? No, if they have it, they would at least tell us its name. It's also possible that the underground market might have it," old Neil muttered. He shook his head as he stood up. He laughed and said, "At least I didn't lose control, and I've lived healthily for decades. Praise the lady." He drew a crimson moon in front of his chest and left the guard room a little dejected. He had lost his usual shrewd look. Klein looked at old Neil's back and suddenly let out a long sigh. He was even more perplexed as to why the higher-ups of the church would hide the acting method. Klein collected himself after some time, placing his attention on the confidential information of the Nighthawks in front of him. Ever since he pulled the youth from the City of Silver into the Tarot Club and learned that the City of Silver still used the ancient names for many things, he found it necessary to enhance his knowledge in these areas. Sometime later, he heard another set of footsteps. These footsteps were slow and steady. At the same time, an image of Dunsmith wearing a black windbreaker flashed past his mind. My spiritual senses have been elevated after fully digesting the seer potion. Klein nodded in understanding. He saw the captain a few seconds later. "A letter for you." Dun extended his right arm and flicked his wrist, tossing the letter over to Klein. Klein lifted his hand and tried to grab the letter, but be it his judgment or reaction, he missed. The letter fell onto the floor, leaving Klein's right hand extended awkwardly in the air. Under the suddenly silent atmosphere, his right hand first became rigid, then he pulled it back toward his head and pretended to smooth out his hair. The light from the gas lamp isn't bright enough, Klein made a perfunctory statement casually. He bent his back and picked up the letter, giving it a cursory glance. Mr. Hornacius. It's a letter from Daxter Guderian. He nodded in understanding and pulled open a drawer to retrieve a letter opener. According to the rules of the Nighthawks, if there was a clear and correct recipient, Roseanne and the rest of the clerks would give the letter directly to the person that the letter was addressed to. If the recipient was anonymous or an unknown name, it would be handed over to Dunn. He could then ask around or make a decision. Klein carefully pried open the letter and took out the piece of paper within. He quickly unfolded the piece of paper and read through it. He realized that the asylum doctor, Daxter, was asking for an urgent meeting at 2 in the afternoon today. Has he obtained the telepathist formula? Or is it regarding something else? Klein lifted the letter in his hand and looked at Dunn. Captain, my informant, the one from the psychology alchemists, wishes to meet me at 2 in the afternoon. Did he say anything else? Dunn asked as if he was expecting this. No. Klein shook his head. Dunn thought for a moment, then said in a heavy voice, Get Leonard to watch over Cheney's gate for the time being. I'll go with you and hide somewhere. These urgent requests to meet could sometimes be a trap. I've heard of many similar incidents. Furthermore, if it's something important, we can act quickly. Captain, you sure are experienced. Not to mention being the most reliable, trustworthy captain without memory issues whenever we have something serious to do. Klein immediately nodded. All right. At 2 in the afternoon. Inside the small shooting range 9 of the Zutland Street Shooting Club. Klein looked at the target that was covered in bullet holes, then glanced at the uneasy Dr. Daxter Guderian. What happened for you to look for mercenaries at the Hound Pub in such a fluster? Only by doing so would the boss of the Hound Pub, right, hand the letter immediately to the Blackthorn Security Company instead of waiting for Klein to collect it himself. Daxter observed Klein's expression and body language, then responded softly, I find Hood Eugen a little abnormal recently. Hood Eugen was the patient from the mental asylum that had roped Daxter into the psychology alchemists. What sort of abnormalities has he exhibited? Klein pressed, displaying his professionalism. Daxter heaved a sigh of relief, as if he had found a pillar of support. He said while deliberating his words, He seems to have really gone insane. Really gone insane? Klein asked in shock. Didn't Hood Eugen feign his illness and infiltrate the mental asylum to attempt to influence the patients in order to train his mental abilities? He had really turned sick, genuine insanity? I think so, Daxter paced around anxiously. I could hold a normal conversation with him in the past and receive guidance on how to correctly use my Beyonder powers. But in the past few days, his thought processes and his condition has become really weird. I can barely communicate with him. He was just like my other patients, even though I've managed to get the telepathist formula as a result. But I cannot determine if it's real or fake. I'm afraid that there might be some uncontrollable changes that might occur. No matter. As a seer who has the mysterious world above the gray fog, I'll be able to determine if it's real or fake. Klein heaved a sigh of relief before creasing his brows and asking, did he come into contact with anyone before he turned abnormal? Only the patients. I cannot guarantee that, though. I'm not in the asylum for the whole day. I also need time to rest, Daxter said, his expression serious. Klein nodded, as if it was something trivial. Don't worry. I'll send someone to protect you in secret. You should find out who Hood Eugen has come into contact with as soon as possible. Also, you have to be careful, he might be testing you. You should also report this to the members of the psychology alchemists and see how the higher-ups of your organization react. All right. Daxter propped up his golden spectacles, recovering the calm of a spectator. He then took out a piece of paper from his pocket and handed it over to Klein. This is the formula for the telepathist potion, but I cannot guarantee its authenticity. We will verify it. Klein smiled in response. He unfolded the piece of paper on the spot and looked at it. Main ingredients. the complete pituitary gland of a mature rainbow salamander, 10 milliliters of spinal fluid from a Farsman rabbit. Supplementary ingredients: chestnut spore 5 grams, dragon tooth grass powder 8 grams, 3 petals of pure white elf flowers, pure water 100 milliliters. Excellent, Klein praised. He folded the piece of paper and stuffed it into the inner pocket of his tuxedo. After exchanging a few more words and ascertaining that the voices which Daxter was hearing were subsiding, Klein bade him farewell. He cautiously made his way to the shooting range reserved for the Nighthawks. Dunn Smith was waiting inside. "Captain, the informant gave me the telepathist formula to thank me for helping him control the side effects of the potion, but he cannot determine the authenticity of the potion." Klein handed the piece of paper to Dunn with a stern expression. Furthermore, he mentioned something else. Dunn read the formula as he listened to the concerns about Hoodugin. After that, he nodded. "I'll immediately assign manpower to keep the mental asylum under surveillance. You haven't had professional training when it comes to these matters and don't to participate in this. Go back and guard Cheney's gate." With that said, he looked at Klein deeply in the eyes and said, "If we take this formula into account, you don't need to accumulate any more meritorious achievements. You can directly receive the clown potion after you pass the examination." Chapter 156. Melissa who takes the long view, and I'm paying double for the clown's formula. And all this because I originally wanted to be rewarded double for the same piece of work I did. Forget it, I don't have the opportunity to mention that I already have the formula to the clown potion. Klein took a deep breath and forced a smile, saying, "Hopefully I can pass the examination smoothly." He was more than happy with Dunn's decision for him to continue to guard Cheney's gate. Not only was he lacking the professional ability to monitor and investigate, but his hand-to-hand combat was far from satisfactory. In terms of shooting, he was considered decent compared to the ordinary police. However, his teammates were all beyonders that have had their physical attributes enhanced. Even if they weren't all marksman level, they were very close. As for hand-to-hand combat, Klein was merely a beginner. Even with a slumber charm, a repose charm, and a dream charm, he was still considered a support class beyonder. It would be easy for him to deal with ordinary people, but he would be in danger if he were to come across any beyonders who were adept at combat. Until I advance to Sequence 8, become skilled in technique-based battles, and master a handful of spells, I can only complete normal supernatural missions on my own. If I successfully steal the power of sealed artifact 3-0782 and make flaring sun charms, that will be even better. It won't be impossible for me to win from a position of an underdog. Klein thought hopefully as he slowly walked back to the Blackthorn Security Company. The next morning when he ended his shift and left Cheney's gate, the Nighthawks still hadn't obtained any useful information from monitoring Hoodugin. For now, they had to place their hopes on their informant's internal investigation. When he returned home, Klein had his breakfast quietly and laid down in his bedroom to sleep until noon. He woke up naturally, washed up, and walked to the first floor, following the smell of cooking food. "Melissa is preparing lunch?" Klein looked at Benson, who was reading the newspaper in the living room. Benson lowered the newspaper and said, "Yes, she has a guest visiting today. I wanted her to chat with her guest while I prepared lunch. But she doesn't trust my cooking and took the guest into the kitchen. How rude." "Benson, you actually managed to quickly realize that Melissa detests your culinary skills." Klein held back his urge to laugh and walked towards the single-seat sofa as he asked, "Melissa's guest?" "Yeah, you should know her. Elizabeth, we met her at Selena's dinner banquet." Benson leaned backwards and continued to read his newspaper comfortably. "It wasn't only at the dinner banquet. She came to visit for real." Klein turned to look at the kitchen with a stunned expression. Just then, Melissa walked out carrying some plates and Elizabeth followed behind, also wearing an apron. "Klein, you're already up? I was just planning on waking you up." Melissa laid the plates on the dining table delightedly as she said, "This is Elizabeth. You know her?" "Hello, Klein." Elizabeth's adorable face flashed a splendid smile as she greeted him. Klein replied gently and politely. After they greeted, Melissa blinked and spoke seriously, "Elizabeth will follow us to the Family Servant Assistance Association later. They hire a few maidservants at home, so she has experience in that. Her opinions might be helpful. Actually, we've already drawn up the requirements for picking a maidservant. Listen to this and see if there's anything that needs to be added. Melissa wiped her hands on her apron and took out a piece of paper from the pocket of her home clothes. She opened it and read it out loud. 1. Healthy. 2. Hardworking and responsible. 3. Good at cooking. 4. Quiet, not rowdy. 5. Simple family background. 6. Looks ordinary. She read the requirements one by one while Klein and Benson gawked with a vacant look. They never expected that hiring a maidservant would be so troublesome. Melissa, weren't you against the idea of hiring a maidservant? Klein subconsciously asked when his sister stopped. Melissa pursed her lips and nodded solemnly. Yes, I was against it. But as my opposition was in vain, I thought we should get this thing done properly. To be able to get it done well, we must be well prepared. Do you have anything that you'd like to add? No. Klein and Benson shook their heads in unison, causing Elizabeth to laugh. After lunch, the four of them took a public carriage to the Tingen Family Servant Assistance Association on Champagne Street. It was similar to domestic help firms that Klein knew of from his previous life, but it was also a little like a charity. They recorded the personal information and job requirements of different maidservants so that the clients could make their selections more easily, while maximizing the maidservants' chances of employment. Part of the organization's funding came from charity organizations, and some came from a percentage of the payment provided by employers. Upon entering the association, Klein and company were greeted warmly. A young lady in a pale yellow ruffled dress led them to some sofas. She smiled and asked, "How may I help you?" Benson, who was pushed forward by his brother and sister, said, "We need to hire a maidservant." "Do you have any requirements?" the young lady asked like clockwork. Benson recalled his siblings' lack of faith in his culinary skills as he said sincerely, "Good at cooking." "Good at cooking?" The young lady creased her eyebrows and said, "To be frank, there are no excellent cooks among the maidservants. Why not hire a chef instead? If you need a female chef, we have quite a number of them in the association." "There is no one who is good at cooking among the maidservants?" Melissa couldn't help but cut in as her initial plan was set back. The young lady nodded and answered affirmatively. The maidservants are either the daughters of lower-class laborers or girls from the villages. They have few opportunities to learn culinary skills. Even after the simple training provided by the association, the most we can guarantee is that their food won't make people sick. Melissa fell silent, finally realizing what it meant to have situations outpace her plans. "That is regrettable," Benson thought. Reorganizing his words, he said, "Maybe we can amend our requirement to a maidservant who is willing to and is capable of learning to cook." "Not bad. Benson is quick-witted. There's no need for me to interject." Klein sat by the side, holding his cane and hat comfortably. "No problem. During cooking training, we took note of girls who had outstanding performance," the young lady replied with a professional smile. "Any other requirements?" "Yes." Benson felt the burn of Melissa's gaze. He swallowed his saliva and took out the piece of paper from his pocket. He then read the items one by one. The young lady listened quietly and only responded after quite a while. "I'll first check through the records and recommend some maidservants that fit the criteria. You don't have to decide immediately. You can pick 2 to 4 of them. Then I will bring them each over to cook for you once. You can decide who to employ then. Of course, you will have to pay the association some extra fees, and you will also have to prepare your own ingredients." "All right." Benson folded the paper and nodded politely. The young lady stood up and walked towards the office, but she turned around after taking 2 steps. She smiled and said, "Can you pass me that paper? I'm worried I will forget some of your requirements." "No problem." Benson held back his urge to laugh when he answered. After a while, the young lady in the pale yellow dress came out with a stack of documents and passed them to Benson. The information had each of the maidservants' real name, birth date, family situation, facial description, health status, past experience, related traits, expected salary, and other information. Seizing the opportunity when Benson and Melissa were reading the information, Elizabeth got closer to Klein and asked softly, Don't you have any requirements? Yes, but this information isn't specific enough, Klein answered perfunctorily. Elizabeth got even more interested. How would you choose? Klein smiled and pointed at the hidden pendulum in his left sleeve. I would divine the best person to become our maidservant by writing down a corresponding statement about each candidate and eliminating them one after another. Elizabeth was stunned, nodding vacantly after nearly 20 seconds. The simplest and the most effective way. I totally forgot that you're. She didn't finish her sentence since Melissa, who had sharp senses, noticed that they were whispering and had looked over. She looked at her best friend and her brother, then she showed an expression of deep thought. Hey, sis, don't misunderstand. We're just talking normally. Klein coughed and picked up some of the information and casually read through them. Very soon, they picked 3 candidates. They were asking for 4 solely 8 pence to 5 solely 2 pence per week. Benson didn't haggle over the maidservant's pay but instead discussed the percentage that he needed to pay to the association. After some friendly haggling, he successfully negotiated the price from the maidservant's 2 weeks' pay to 1 week pay instead. However, he had to pay a transportation fee of 1 solely for them to bring the maidservants over to try cooking. After that, Elizabeth bade the trio farewell and left while the siblings took a public carriage back to Daffodil Street. On the way back, Klein was getting uncomfortable under Melissa's scrutinizing gaze. When he got home, he went to the 2nd floor directly. Klein, Melissa called him in a serious tone after thorough consideration. She said, if you want to get engaged with Elizabeth, you have to work harder. Her father is an important businessman, and her mother is the daughter of a baron. Wait, engaged? When did this happen? Klein looked at his sister in confusion. How far-reaching is her concern? Chapter 157. Item of his dreams. No, we are not. Klein didn't have the chance to retort before Benson interrupted with a smile. Although Elizabeth is indeed a little young and her family is much more outstanding than ours, I find the two of you quite suitable for each other. But you might have to wait a few more years. She is still studying at a public school and wants to enter university. Marriage should be something to consider only 6 to 7 years later. Of course, you can get engaged sooner than that. Can you guys not think that far ahead? Klein took in a deep breath. I do not fancy Elizabeth, or, well, more accurately, I do not fancy a girl who is younger than me by too much. I prefer girls who are more mature. Truthfully, I can accept anyone within a reasonable age gap, just not now. He added inwardly in exasperation. You like girls who are more mature? Melissa knitted her brows. Then you should quickly settle the issue regarding your marriage. Klein couldn't understand his sister's leap in logic. He asked in confusion, why? Melissa explained seriously, you will be about 25 when you finish saving up for your marriage. Girls that are more mature than you will either be married or engaged when they reach that age. Do you want to chase after a widow? What the? Klein thought to himself in Mandarin as he wore a blank expression. Benson smiled and refuted his sister, Melissa, you don't understand. In this day and age, it isn't rare to see women in their 30s who isn't married or engaged within the middle class. They are mostly followers of the goddess, and all have the ability to provide for themselves. They would rather be single than stuck in a marriage that they are not satisfied with. Yes, that's what I read from the family magazine. Is that so? Melissa was a 16-year-old girl after all. She didn't have a great understanding concerning matters like this. Upon seeing his siblings getting roused up from the conversation, Klein coughed and said, what I meant by mature is their mental state. They don't need to be older than me. Furthermore, the person that should be worried about their marriage is Benson. I'm sorry, brother, I had no choice, he apologized in his heart. Melissa froze for a moment, then nodded heavily. That's right. Benson was just about to elaborate on the marital problems of the middle class when he suddenly shivered. He looked at his sister who was staring at him and said, I am now at the cusp of a turning point in my life. I have to devote all my attention to studying. I will only be confident of chasing after my desired girl when I have found a job that I'm satisfied with and have a reasonable amount of savings. Only then will I be able to provide her with a good life. Klein and Melissa froze, then asked in unison, you have a girl that you fancy? Benson, who had merely given a perfunctory reply, was shocked. He shook his head in a hurry. No, I was merely giving an example. In a dark, gloomy house of Backland, Hillston Borough, a middle-aged man with graying hair sat silently on a rocking chair in front of an unlit fireplace with a dark-colored pipe in his hand. He looked at the guest on the sofa. He was the master of this building, Isengard Stanton, a private detective with notable fame. But he didn't set up an office, merely hiring assistants to assist him. Isengard, who was dressed in a white shirt and black vest, brought the pipe to his lips and inhaled in an intoxicated manner before slowing exhaling. The fee for a 30-minute consultation is £1. If I were you, I would definitely not waste a second. The two ladies on the sofa across from him were Furs Wall and Zio Dericha. They had found materials relating to Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos and wanted to ask this detective to consolidate the habits and actions of their target. Of course, they had removed Kalangos's name and changed the description regarding supernatural incidents. Zio Dericha handed the folder containing the documents to Isengard's assistant, a brown-haired young man wearing gold-framed spectacles. Mr. Detective, I hope that you can find habits in the target's actions using the material we have provided. Even though she wasn't tall, Zio Dericha had an air of authority when she sat straight and spoke with a deep voice. Isengard stared at her and received the docket from his assistant. He opened the folder and took out the material within. He set down his pipe and focused on reading page after page without missing a single one. 10 minutes later, this gentleman slowly tapped on the handle. The target has an obsession with the wind. He won't stay for long in a polluted area in Backland, the capital of dust. In other words, he could be staying at the Empress Borough, West Borough, Hillston Borough, Sherwood Borough, or the suburbs of the North Borough. The target is a psychotic serial killer with the need to kill someone every other day. The most logical thing he could do is to target the vagrants that have nowhere to go. Even the police have no records of the exact number of vagrants in Backland. The target wouldn't be living in an area too near or too far from North Borough or Backland Bridge, which have the highest concentration of vagrants. It would be the act of someone unsophisticated to search for victims that are too close to him. That isn't consistent with your descriptions. If the target has to spend a large amount of time before he can find someone to murder, then he might lose control of his desires and commit crimes that would easily expose himself. The target is an experienced sailor and has exceptional mobility in the water. A reasonable deduction would be that he wouldn't be living somewhere too far away from the water. If anything unexpected happens, that would be his best means of escape. In summary, we can outline the possible radius of activity for the target. He should be living somewhere close to the Backland Bridge area. Perhaps somewhere close to both banks of the Tussock River, the West Borough or the Sherwood Borough. I can only deduce this from the materials that you have given me. Even though they didn't understand all of it, his deductions seemed to make sense. Zio and Furs looked at each other and nodded. They took back their materials and stood up to leave. Seeing his assistant send off the two ladies, Isengard took out a bronze item from his vest pocket. It was an open paperback book. In the middle of the book was a vertical eye. Isengard rocked his chair, rubbing the item while softly muttering to himself, "Kalangos has infiltrated Backland?" In a particular basement of Pritz Harbor, the hanged man Alger sat in a chair, looking coldly at a struggling man. This man was dressed like a sailor. His head was enveloped by a film of pale blue water and his face was purple from holding his breath. He was scratching at the film on his face with both hands, but all he could do was flick droplets of liquid. Finally, he could no longer hold his breath and gave a signal of submission. Alger smiled, then nonchalantly clapped his hands. The thin film of water dispersed, turning into droplets that fell to the ground. The sailor took in a deep breath and coughed violently. He coughed so hard that it tugged at his heart and lungs. After waiting for the man to recover, Alger leaned back. He emulated the peaceful and calm tone of the fool. "Tell me the reason why Kalangos went to Backland. He's there to complete a commission, but I'm not sure about the details." The pirate had completely lost the will to resist. He answered honestly, "All I know is that he might receive something that he wants. Kalangos once boasted in front of us. He said that if this mission was a success, he would be able to obtain something he's dreamed of getting for a long time. The 4 pirate kings would then become the 5 pirate kings. An object he's been dreaming of obtaining? Alger knitted his brows and slipped into deep thought. Klein didn't rest on Monday morning. He followed his plan and continued his investigation on the buildings with red chimneys in Tingen. Unfortunately, he didn't come across his target. He returned home near noon. He heated up the leftovers from yesterday's dinner and paired them with bread before taking an hour's nap. At about 20 minutes to 3 in the afternoon, Klein put his book down and sealed his room with a wall of spirituality, once again entering the mysterious world above the gray fog. He sat at the seat of honor at the ancient bronze table, extending his hand toward the crimson star representing sun while ignoring the frequency of his heartbeats. In the city of silver, Derek Berg was sweating on the practice grounds. His vision suddenly blurred as a heavy fog entered his view. He saw the fool sitting high above, deep within the fog. He froze, then stopped whatever he was doing and bowed his head. When the illusion vanished, he counted his heartbeats silently and carried his silver sword to a rest area quickly. 1,000 heartbeats later, he locked himself in a bathroom. After about 10 breaths, he saw the red light swell over him and swallow him in an instant. Above the gray fog, Klein leaned back into his chair and tapped his left molar twice to stealthily activate his spirit vision. He saw that the mottled color deep within the sun's ether body had turned pure, akin to the light of dawn. He smiled and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Bard." At the same time, he saw the stars behind the sun's chair shift quickly, turning into the symbol of the sun. It transformed without my will, as if it was a reflection of the sun. Also, other than the palace, table, and chairs, the items that I conjure cannot be preserved once I leave this world. They are very special. There sure are many secrets to this world above the gray fog. Klein took in everything in front of him as he contemplated. Derek lowered his head and replied humbly, "This is all due to your assistance. This is but the beginning." He wasn't surprised that the fool knew that he had consumed the potion. Klein took out his silver pocket watch and looked at the time. He chuckled and said, "Then let us start the gathering. Remember, the frequency, or should I say gap between the gatherings, should be about the same in the future." As he was speaking, he established a connection with the crimson stars representing justice and the hanged man before pulling them into the majestic palace. Audrey looked at the scene before her and immediately greeted him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. I have a page of the diary of Emperor Roselle with me." "Good afternoon, Mr. Sunday. Have you gotten the formula for telepathist?" Chapter 158. Preparedness averts peril. How enviable it is for Miss Justice to always maintain a cheerful mood. I wish I could be like that. Listening to her lively greetings, Klein couldn't help but sigh wistfully. He then recalled the time when she had taken out £1,000 so easily, and he realized that it would be very difficult if he wanted to maintain his cheerful emotions like Miss Justice. The son, Derek Berg, was a young man that cared a lot about his reputation. He immediately replied, "I have obtained the telepathist formula." For the past week, he had been settling the inheritance that his parents had left him. Besides the property, furniture, and a few sentimental items, the rest of the valuable items were brought to the black market in the City of Silver in exchange for the telepathist formula and the Bard potion's ingredients. His meals were now rationed. However, he believed that the situation wouldn't be for long. When he passes the combat examination, he would then join the team that cleansed the things of the dark in the outskirts of the city and be paid a decent amount. "When I become stronger, I'll apply to become a member of the elite squad, to explore the depths of the dark and find a way to remove the curse." Derek thought with hope as he looked towards the fool who was engulfed in the fog. He noticed that last time, after Miss Justice made a request to Mr. Fool, she was able to produce a page of the unknown Roselle diary out of thin air. Although Derek didn't quite understand what had happened, he felt that it'd be better if he watched Mr. Fool. First, recall the formula in your head. Then, grab the pen by your side and instill it with the strong desire to express your thoughts. Klein casually leaned back in his high chair. As the sun was from the City of Silver, which might be the forsaken land of the gods, the pen that instantiated before him wasn't a fountain pen, but a quill instead. Of course, there still wasn't any ink. Derek didn't dare to doubt what the fool said, so he immediately grabbed the quill that suddenly appeared by his hand. He followed the fool's instruction, and as expected, he saw the telepathist potion formula appear on the brown goatskin parchment before him within seconds. After looking through it twice, Derek silently pushed the promised item towards Miss Justice. Audrey was overjoyed and eager, but she took the parchment gracefully. She glanced at the page, and the words that Klein had translated came into sight. Main ingredients: Phantom Netherdrake's complete pituitary gland, 10 milliliters of half-spectre rabbit. Supplementary ingredients: main ingredients that I've never heard of? I don't know enough. Audrey, who had been trying to learn more about the different types and names of Beyonder ingredients from Furs and Zio, seemed to fret in thought. During such moments, she would completely forget how a spectator should behave. Suddenly, Audrey heard a light rapping sound. She quickly looked towards the seat of honor at the long bronze table subconsciously. She was surprised to see Mr. Fool rapping at the edge of the table with his right index finger while he gestured to her with a nod. What's going on? Audrey was confused as her eyes wore a vacant look. Just when she was about to ask, the corner of her eyes suddenly saw some changes on the telepathist formula. There were remarks next to some of the ingredients. Main ingredients: Phantom Netherdrake's complete pituitary gland, also known as rainbow salamander, 10 milliliters of half-spectre rabbit, also known as Farsman rabbit. Supplementary ingredients: I know all of these. Audrey was stunned at first, then there was an intense surge of delight from the bottom of her heart. Thank you, Mr. Fool. You're really very knowledgeable. She looked towards the seat of honor as she thanked and sincerely complimented him. The hanged man Alger didn't know what had happened, but he felt extreme contempt towards what Justice had said. How could you describe a godlike figure with the word knowledgeable? His existence alone is equivalent to knowledge itself to a certain extent. Klein accepted Miss Justice's compliments without any misgivings because this wasn't something he could have done just because he had chanced upon the psychology alchemist's telepathist formula. After he pulled the sun into the tarot club, he had been taking precautions against such problems by taking into consideration the sun's special circumstances of being from the City of Silver. He had been constantly studying ancient terminology. Therefore, even if Daxter Guderian hadn't managed to get the formula in time, he could have made the notations easily. Through prior divination and comparison, he had made certain that both telepathist formulas were accurate. This is why we say, preparedness averts peril, Klein thought smugly. Audrey looked at the telepathist formula a few times and then reined in her gaze unwillingly. She then personally expressed Roselle's diary onto a page. You deserve this. She put down her pen and looked towards the fog-engulfed fool. In addition to this, I'll give your adorer another 300. Is 300 pounds okay? She sounded a little guilty because the 3 pages of Roselle's diary only cost her 20 pounds, while the sheriff formula at sequence 8 required 450 pounds. In other words, from the perspective of simple math, she had to pay another 430 pounds on top of the 3 pages of the diary. However, Audrey felt that it was thanks to her luck that the seller didn't know the value of Roselle's diary. It allowed her to buy it at a low price. Emperor Roselle's diary costs at least 50 pounds per page. Audrey held her fist and encouraged herself. 300 pounds? Until today, I've only seen that much money at Sir Deweyville's place. Klein sighed and pretended to not be interested in money as he nodded and said, a reasonable deal. This is my adorer's information. He avoided speaking of terms like Backlund Bank and anonymous account verbally through the fool's mouth as they damaged his image. He made them appear on the parchment before her. Klein had taken time to visit Backlund Bank's Tingen branch last Wednesday while investigating the houses with red chimneys. He had disguised himself and opened an anonymous bank account. The account only required one to memorize his account number and the corresponding password in order to withdraw cash from any Backlund Bank branch. If one found that it wasn't secure enough, he could also request to add in a signature and thumbprint verification. But that would be more troublesome. In order to keep his identity secret, Klein left it with a password. The password is written in ancient Hermes. The fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. As ancient Hermes itself can be used for rituals and prayers, anyone who dares to copy the password would be reciting my name. Then I'll immediately receive a signal, and can simply find out who's the one trying to steal my wealth from the world above the gray fog. Klein was very satisfied with the idea that he came up with. The only downfall was that it would slightly expose the existence of the fool, but the risk was within an acceptable range. Audrey pushed the diary page to Mr. Fool as she took the parchment with the information of the fool's adorer. Recorded on it was the Backlund Bank and a bunch of numbers that formed the anonymous bank account. I wonder if Mr. Fool's adorer is a male or female, and which sequence he or she is. He must be very powerful, at least not weaker than Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos. Audrey couldn't stop her thoughts from wandering, but she quickly focused and memorized the anonymous account. It doesn't have to be so troublesome. Just then, she heard the fool's low yet gentle voice. When you get home, recite my name and you'll be able to write down the information directly. This would be just like when I drew the red chimney scene through divination. An account number is very important. You can't memorize it incorrectly. Klein added in his head. That works too? From Mr. Fool's words, he appears very confident. He lives up to his status of a godlike figure if he can even do this. Audrey was stunned at first before coming to the realization that everything seemed to make logical sense. But why did I have to memorize the formula earlier? Audrey was suddenly confused again. At that moment, Klein pressed down on the page of Roselle's diary, but he wasn't in a hurry to read it. He looked to the side at the sun and calmly asked, "What compensation would you like?" Derek thought seriously and said, "As of now, I don't have anything that I desperately need. I should digest the Bard potion very soon. I shall wait until then to request my compensation." Yes, perhaps to prepare for the corresponding Sequence 8 formula or the necessary ingredients. Sequence 8 is light suppliant, which I have, but the ingredients. Even if I had them, I would have no idea how to give them to you. Wait, he used the word digest. Indeed, the City of Silver knows of the acting method. The highest sequence there is only sequence for, so are they limited by ingredients? Klein nodded in deep thought, agreeing to the deal. Audrey also sharply noticed the word fist. She weighed her words and asked, "Mr. Sun, are you aware of the acting method?" Derek looked at Miss Justice in confusion and answered straightforwardly, "It's nothing strange. The general education classes in the City of Silver teaches the acting method. The acting method is taught in general education classes." Audrey stole a glance at the hanged man and realized that he was looking back at her. The two of them suddenly fell silent. The origin of the sun is indeed mysterious. I wonder where Mr. Fool pulled him into the tarot club from. The more I think about it, the more I revere him. Audrey settled down and looked at the fool who didn't look visibly surprised in any way. Then, Alger probed, "Mr. Sun, do you talk about any key things to look out for with respect to the acting method?" "Yes." Derek nodded without hesitation. "It's clearly stated in our general education classes that the one and only key point for the acting method is to remember that you're only acting. As expected, we're using an ingenious method to go around obstacles and completely break down the remnant spirits in the potion without submitting to it. The Sun, you're such a simple boy. You just shared important information by accident." Klein smiled and cast his eyes on the diary page before him. Chapter 159. Bestowment and sacrifice. Messy Chinese sentences were scribbled on the yellowish-brown goatskin. August 2nd. This goes deeper than I imagined. History sure is something that can be manipulated easily. August 5th. I witnessed the abilities of a high-sequence beyonder today. It was scary indeed. There's a qualitative change that has happened to them in a particular aspect. It was as though they've transformed into a deity. It's no wonder that we describe them as demigods, though I think calling them legendary beings is more fitting. August 6th. There's something strange going on. Why would the 7 major churches adopt such a strange attitude towards the potions? At the low to middle sequences, they not only provide the main ingredients to those who manage to advance, but they're also generous enough to share the formulas and demonstrate the process needed to create the potion. They would also explain in detail if a ritual is needed to create the medicine, yet finished potions are the only things they provide to those who are advancing to the higher sequences. This isn't logical. Shouldn't they keep the formula a secret for the lower sequence potions and give the candidate the completed potion since it's relatively easy to gather the necessary ingredients and create the potion? As for the higher sequence potions, shouldn't they share the formula and make the promising members search for the ingredients due to the difficulty of obtaining the main ingredients? There must be some hidden secret to this. August 9th. The events of the past 2 days have made me feel uncomfortable. I started the Industrial Revolution with my own hands and personally ushered in the age of steam and machinery, but this will create the conditions necessary for the evil god to descend upon this world? What does he mean? The conditions necessary for the evil god to descend upon this world? Klein knitted his brows, his index finger tapped on the edge of the ancient table. Did Mr. Fool encounter a difficult problem? Anything that can trouble him must be something of another level. Audrey looked at the leader obscured by the thick fog and interpreted his state through his body language. Klein was indeed pondering over the problem related to the upper echelons, but he didn't arrive at an answer. He considered the possibility of using divination to gain some sort of revelation. Yes, it would be impossible to divine something of use with such simple sentences. I'm not a prophet. What if I divine with the statement, the conditions necessary for the evil god to descend upon this world? It feels too risky. The evil god might not be as horrifying as the eternal blazing sun, but its abilities might be much more mysterious. It might be able to trace the divinations back to me. There's also no way to divine how large of a risk I'll be taking if I were to divine that statement. After all, just divining if something poses any danger is dangerous once it has deities involved. I'll keep this question in mind and put more effort into observation. The arrangement of the churches regarding potions is indeed mysterious. I wonder what kind of secrets they're hiding? Perhaps I'll receive some hints about that once spirit medium, spirit guide daily is made archbishop or a high-ranking deacon and enters the core of the church. Roselle's description does make me look forward to the power of high-sequence beyonders. Many thoughts flashed through his mind before Klein stopped tapping on the edge of the ancient table and looked at Justice, the hanged man, and the son. You can start your discussion freely now. Alger immediately said, Mr. Fool, Miss Justice, I received a new piece of information. Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos infiltrated Backlund to complete a difficult mission. He might stay for an extended period of time and create an appalling tragedy. Also, I know that this incident involves a very important item, an item that would allow Kalangos to quickly become a high-sequence beyonder. Quickly become a high-sequence beyonder? Does he not fear losing control of himself? Audrey asked, adopting the posture of a spectator. Kalangos was only a sequence 6 wind-blessed, so there was still a sequence between him and sequence 4. Alger had expected this question. He answered honestly, that's why the object is important to him. Of course, those are simply my deductions. The information I receive goes like this. Kalangos believes that once he completes the commission and obtains the object, he will be the equal of Nast, the king of the 5 seas. The 4 pirate kings would then become the 5 pirate kings, and the 7 pirate admirals will be reduced to 6. The average person might not aware of this, but as beyonders, we should know that pirate kings are either high-sequence beyonders, or are able to reach the combat strength of a high-sequence beyonder with the use of beyonder boats and mysterious items. For Kalangos to be acknowledged as their equal, he must reach standards that are close to that. That's my deduction. All I know is that the king of the 5 seas, Nast, is a sequence 4 beyonder, but I'm not sure of the name of his potion. Klein listened on silently, not giving his opinion. The son, Derek Berg, didn't understand anything the hanged man said. He didn't know who was who, but he still listened attentively. He felt a new door had presented itself in his world. Pirates? The place they live in has seas that are mentioned in books? Then, the environment these people live in is very different from the City of Silver. They don't seem to be very worried about the curse or the attacks of the things of the dark. It definitely makes me very curious. But Mr. Fool once instructed me not to ask about the secrets of others. It's a very rude gesture, Derek thought in his heart, once again observing the hanged man and justice. Your deduction is very reasonable. Of course, that could also be a mysterious item that could hold its own against a high-sequence beyonder, Justice replied with a smile. The hanged man looked at the fog-enshrouded fool, pondered over his words, before he looked at Justice and emphasized, there are two key points in what I said just now, the first being the fact that Kalangos will stay in Backland for some time. The second is that the incident involves a very important and very mysterious object. So, Mr. Fool, are you not tempted? There is ample time for you to send your adorer to Backland. Alger added in his heart but didn't dare say it out loud. All he could do was beat about the bush. Mr. Alger, you don't need to emphasize this repeatedly, I know what you are getting at. But my abilities do not allow me to interfere in these matters. Furthermore, I can't leave Tingen without permission. Klein leaned back and thought in frustration. Ignoring the adorer, I can actually find two relatively strong beyonders to help. One is Daly, who has advanced to Sequence 6, but I cannot tell her everything. The most I can do is mention that I've gotten some information that Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos has infiltrated Backland and is living at a particular street and what he plans to do. That way, Daly might directly enlist the help of the Nighthawks, making the situation very complicated and troublesome. If you guys cannot find anybody to help you when the time comes, then I can try that to prevent a tragedy. The second person is Mr. Azik, but I cannot expose my identity as the fool to him. I don't have a proper reason to get him to interfere with this incident. Many thoughts flashed through his mind as Klein replied slowly, I'm aware. Seeing how the fool continued to not place much importance in the matter regarding Kalangos, he sighed and held back his disappointment. He started asking about the investigation Miss Justice conducted last week. In conclusion, we have more or less targeted the general area Kalangos will be at, and will soon start the next phase of investigations. Audrey first gave a simple summary, then with the attitude that she was doing something important, said, we need more information, preferably the hobbies and habits of Kalangos. Alger recalled, he loves fish, especially fish from the sea. He would slice it and eat it raw. He also likes hard liquor, and despises champagne, red wine and the like. He will often look for women to relieve his needs whenever he heads to shore, and with his strong body, one woman will not be enough to satisfy him. He's used to using cold weapons and avoids hot weapons. He cannot be away from water for long periods of time. What I mean is that he needs to swim or dive once every couple of days. Audrey committed these facts to memory, creating an ample character of Kalangos in her mind. Let's hope that the investigation will be a success. It's a pleasure working with you. She smiled after Alger was done. My pleasure. All Alger could do was force himself to believe in Miss Justice, who had considerable power in Backland. Throughout the interaction, Klein seemed to be listening intently, but in reality, his thoughts had been diverted to another question. That was the question of how to deliver ingredients to Sun if he did manage to obtain them. Now that he had a passable understanding of the field of mysticism, Klein instinctively followed the line of thought of using ritualistic magic. This reliance was natural given the successes he had when using ritualistic magic. When I was previously flipping through the confidential information of the Nighthawks, I came across records of the goddess bestowing holy items to her followers. There were also records of items descending in rituals involving evil gods or devils. Does this mean that I can bestow someone something when responding to their prayers, and transfer materials that way? In previous attempts, I could only reply with thoughts containing pictures and voices. But that doesn't mean that it'll always stay that way. There could be some new changes when I advance to Sequence 8. There's also something important to consider. Can I bring material from the real world into the world above the gray fog? Oh right, there's often a step for sacrifices in rituals involving evil gods and devils. Can I consider sacrificing something to myself? In that way, perhaps I can bring some material from the real world into the world above the gray fog. If this attempt is successful, I can get items directly from Justice, the Sun, and the Hanged Man, and then bestow them to myself. Yes, sacrifice is considered a more advanced ritual, so I won't be able to learn of it for now. The most important thing to do now is to improve my abilities. Klein reined in his thoughts, and once again listened in on the conversation of the other members. He listened as their discussion changed from Kalangos to the characteristics of particular monsters. Sometime later, he smiled. Let's end it here for today. By your will. The Sun, Justice, and the Hanged Man stood up at the same time. After severing the connections of the members, Klein quickly descended from the fog and left the mysterious space. When he returned to his room, he dispelled the wall of spirituality and pulled back the curtains by the oriel window, allowing the sunlight to shine in. There are 2 important things to do this week. The first is to get examined and advance to sequence 8. The second is to make flaring sun charms. Its powers might be even higher than that of sequence 7 or 6. Klein looked outside with anticipation. Tomorrow, I should be able to receive the report of Mr. Isaac's paranormal disturbances tomorrow. Chapter 160. Seizing the Opportunity. Tuesday morning. Having completed his mysticism curriculum, Klein didn't look for a quiet corner to read comparison of ancient and modern names or Nighthawk's case compendium, and instead stayed in the break room to play cards with Leonard, Kenley, and Royale. I only told Mr. Isaac to create an opportunity for me to take sealed artifact 3-0782 out. It'll still depend on my improvisation skills to seize the opportunity. Klein's mind wasn't on his cards, so he played terribly. He lost 5 solely in an hour, and he felt the pinch. He planned to concentrate on the game to recover some of his cash. After he bought various ingredients for the flaring sun charms yesterday afternoon, his private stash of cash reduced to less than £1 once again. Plus, he had to pay 2 solely every day for the carriage rental fees to search for the house with the red chimney. As they were waiting for Kenley to shuffle the cards, he picked up the copper penny before him and spun it casually. He suddenly felt Royale's gaze on him, a very intense gaze. What? Klein was first stunned, then looked at the copper penny that was about to fall. Is she wary of me cheating with divination? We're just playing cards amongst ourselves. Do we have to be so serious about this? He suddenly understood and slammed down the penny with a dry laugh. Just then, Dunn Smith knocked on the door and entered. He looked around and said, "There's a situation in Morristown. Leonard, please handle it." Morristown? Klein felt his mind jolt as he pretended to ask curiously, "Captain, what kind of situation?" Dunn glanced over and explained, "Recently, there have been a few paranormal cases in the area. Firstly, people would hear sobs when walking past the cemetery and see vague figures flash by. Then, a widow encountered her deceased husband when she woke up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. She nearly fainted from the fright. In addition, there was an elderly man who lived alone. He began hearing heavy footsteps reverberating in the house all the time. However, silence reigned once again the moment he lights a candle or gas lamp. The people in the town are believers of the goddess, so the local priest reported the situation. No one got hurt, and it almost borders on the level of a prank. It should be Mr. Isaac? Klein used an expression and tone that he had rehearsed many times. Captain, there might be a secret link for these paranormal cases to happen so suddenly. In this situation, divination could provide an important clue. I think I can help Leonard. Upon hearing that, Leonard's green eyes immediately locked onto Klein. He was apparently trying to find clues and traces from Klein's face. Dunn nodded first, but remained quiet and hesitant. When Klein saw the captain's response, he immediately added, "Some of these things might require ritualistic magic to purify them." Makes sense. Dunn thought and said, "You and Leonard will head to Morristown then?" Without anyone saying anything else, he additionally added, "You won't be able to make it for your combat training in the afternoon. I'll send someone to inform Gawain." Phew, the first step is complete. Klein silently let out a sigh. He quickly packed away his solely and pence. Then, he suddenly paused and looked sideways at Dunn. He said solemnly, "Captain, I think we should prepare for the worst. If there's a powerful wraith behind the paranormal events, It might be very dangerous for only Leonard and I plus. It takes 3 hours to get to Morristown, right? Even if we managed to send a telegram to request for backup in time, we would still have to hold out for quite a while. So? Dunn interrupted. I want to get the assistance of another teammate. Klein pretended to think for a moment and said, and, according to the rules, a mission with 3 or more Nighthawks involved can apply for a level 3 sealed artifact. Yes, 3-0782 is most suited for this job. Upon hearing that, Leonard laughed and said, exactly your style. Careful, cautious, taking no risks. You seem to be implying that I'm a coward. I'm a person who looked directly at the eternal blazing sun. Klein pretended that he didn't hear Leonard and earnestly looked at Dunn Smith. Captain, what do you think? We should really take extra care against any accidents. There have been too many coincidences lately. Dunn nodded thoughtfully and looked at the other 2 teammates. Kenley, join Leonard and Klein on their trip to Morristown. Oh, hurry up and write an application. After I sign it, retrieve sealed artifact 3-0782 from Cheney's gate. All right, the short Kenley said, putting down the cards in his hand. All right. Klein fist-pumped in his mind while he looked anxious and solemn on the outside. At that very moment, Sikatron was monitoring Hoodugin in the asylum while Fry was on duty at Cheney's gate. Klein left the recreation room and put on his black tuxedo. He took his hat and cane, then waited together with Leonard for Kenley at the stairway that connected to the basement. There was no one there, and it was extremely quiet. Leonard suddenly looked sideways at Klein and said, I think you'd better give up on any unrealistic dreams. Klein replied in confusion. Leonard walked forward and stood by the edge of the stairs. He looked into the darkness of the stairway. Even during a mission, it will be impossible for you to discover my secret and understand my uniqueness. Bro, can you stop thinking so highly about yourself? Did you think I applied for this mission to spy on you? I didn't even have such thoughts. Enlightened, Klein chuckled. How can you be so sure that my uniqueness won't help to reveal your secret? Leonard's expression grew grave, but he then smiled and said, It will, huh? I shall wait for you to discover it then. When I gather more information and items, I will go to the world above the gray fog to help you do a divination. You're welcome. Klein thought sarcastically in his head. Soon, the small-framed Kenley brought the mutated sun's sacred emblem up the winding stairs. When Klein felt the unique warmth and purity, he secretly heaved a sigh of relief. He knew that he had finally completed the very first and most difficult step in his plan of siphoning the powers of the eternal blazing sun's divine blood. Then, the 3 of them left the Blackthorn Security Company and walked to Zutland Street. They walked towards the carriage that belonged to the Nighthawks. Will the purifying effect bother the horse? Kenley suddenly asked anxiously. I don't want a horse that can only praise the sun to pull the carriage. He had been a Nighthawk for longer than Klein, but he was far from experienced. No, sealed artifact 3-0782 only purifies living entities with a high level of intelligence. Klein lowered his voice in response. If not, I wouldn't be bitten by insects, he added blankly in his head. Oh, I see. Haha, I didn't read the information thoroughly enough. Kenley pressed down on his black silk hat and laughed in enlightenment. As Klein had yet to master the skill of driving of a carriage, he sat inside the carriage for the following 3 hours. He rubbed the sealed artifact 3-0782 in his hand while he watched Leonard and Kenley take turns driving. They finally arrived at Morristown around lunchtime. How beautiful! Kenley complimented sincerely as they stepped down from the carriage and looked towards the boundless golden wheat fields that surrounded the town. The dates representing the volcanic constellation was coming to an end, and the bumper harvest constellation was going to rule everyone's life. Leonard was in the driver's seat as he looked around and opened his mouth, as though he was going to recite a sonnet. But in the end, he only spurted one sentence, "How beautiful!" Klein held back the urge to laugh as he put on his top hat, took his cane, and got off the carriage. At that moment, a middle-aged man in a black priest's gown walked over. He drew a crimson moon on his chest and said, "Praise the Lady. Are you the friends that St. Selena Cathedral sent to help us?" "Yes, priest sire. May the goddess bless you." Leonard jumped off the carriage and replied with a smile, "We're here to take care of the recent paranormal incidents." Seemingly. The gray-haired, blue-eyed sire saw many townsfolk approaching as he quickly emphasized. Morse Town wasn't big. Regardless of which direction one chose to travel in, one would enter the plains within 10 minutes. The people who stayed there knew each other, so what happened earlier had spread. Many townsfolk were waiting for the Church of the Evernight Goddess to send people to resolve the problem. Hence, when they saw that the priest was greeting 3 strangers, they quickly surrounded them out of concern and curiosity. Some tiptoed and some tried to hear what they were saying. Leonard chuckled and said, "Priest, don't worry. We're professionals. Look, we brought holy water, silver daggers, dark sacred emblems, and also garlic." He took out the described items from the inner pockets of his clothes as though he was pulling a magic trick. "Garlic? Are you trying to stink the spirits to death?" Klein found it ridiculous yet funny as he watched Leonard's performance. Sire wore a look of confusion, and he even started to suspect that the St. Selena Cathedral had sent over a bunch of frauds. The citizens who surrounded them revealed gratified smiles, as though they were finally in safe hands. Leonard got close to Priest Sire and explained softly into his ear, "They believe in these things." Without waiting for the priest's reply, he added, "Let's have lunch at the church first. Then we shall take care of those matters." Yes, lunch is very important. When those paranormal incidents are taken care of, it'll be time to take turns looking after sealed artifact 3-0782, and also the opportunity for me to make flaring sun charms. Hopefully, everything goes smoothly. Of course, making flaring sun charms during the daytime would get the best results. Klein thought, brimming with anticipation. Chapter 161. Inverted Mausoleum. Most of the buildings in Morse Town adhered to a style that was popular 100 years ago. The most eye-catching building in the town was the black cathedral spire. After settling the carriage, Klein and the others quickly finished their lunch of bread, toast, bacon, butter, and coffee. We can still tolerate about 2 hours and 35 minutes of sealed artifact 3-0782's purification. Kenley stood at the door of the church and took out a pocket watch from his suit's pocket. "I suggest dealing with the suspected haunting incidents first to prevent the situation from getting worse. Then we can return to the church and take turns watching over the sealed artifact to recover." Under normal circumstances, Sequence 9, 8, and 7 Beyonders had to stay far away from the mutated sun's sacred emblem for 2 hours to recover completely, or at least an hour if they were to make a partial recovery. "All right. I have no objections." Klein and Leonard spoke in unison. "Then which case should we deal with first?" Kenley asked. Leonard wiped away his frivolous attitude and said, "Let's start with the old man living alone who heard heavy footsteps in his house." "Why?" Kenley asked instinctively. Klein was also interested to hear an explanation. Could this be the intuition of a poet? He mocked Leonard secretly. Leonard shifted his gaze from Kenley's face to Klein's, then looked at Kenley again. He smiled. "Because it's the closest to the church." "How did you know that?" "It's not written in the records," Klein asked. Leonard snickered. "Didn't I go to the bathroom during our meal? I came across a trainee priest on my way back and had a conversation. He told me that Noah's house was close to the church." "Oh yeah, the old man's name is Noah. He sure lives up to his name as an experienced nighthawk when it comes to performing missions." Klein gave a dry laugh. He turned to Kenley and said, "Then let's go to Noah's house first." "All right." Kenley didn't have any objections. They arrived at Noah's house a mere minute later. Noah was an old man with thinning white hair. He had lost his left hand in a war when he was younger and had no choice but to leave the army. He returned to his hometown after he received his compensation. At that moment, he opened the door and looked at the 3 strangers in front of him before looking at Sire, who was rushing over from the cathedral. He said with a raspy voice, "Come in, I hope that you can solve my problem. I heard that you brought holy water, sacred emblems, a silver dagger, and garlic. This is great. My worries have eased greatly. Please forgive my blabbering. You have to understand the condition of an old man after not being able to sleep peacefully for 2 nights. Oh my goddess, I've been so scared all this time that my head feels like it's in a cloud." Leonard suddenly straightened his back when he entered the house, his eyes surveying the surroundings. After that, Klein felt a cold aura within the room. Those were traces of activity left behind by a ghost. There really was an impure being here. Kenley was the last one to notice as he suppressed his voice. Very weak, Leonard said with a relaxed tone as he retracted his gaze. The Midnight Poet was a job with a relatively high spiritual sensitivity when compared to all the other sequence 8s in the church's records. Yes. Klein could feel the warmth and purifying energy of sealed artifact 3-0782 quickly dispelling the sinister aura in the room without any trouble. At this moment, the people of the town had all gathered at Noah's house, all looking curiously at Klein, Leonard, and Kenley. Leonard cleared his throat and recited, "We have the blessings of the goddess. Those impure beings will vanish quickly and won't bring about any more trouble." After that, he shot a look at Klein for him to perform a purification ritual for everyone to see. Klein shot a look back. Of course, he didn't know if Leonard understood what his gaze meant. But clearly, Leonard understood. He said softly, "You're the expert in rituals. All right, blame me for being the one who volunteered for this mission." Klein tidied his clothes and took out the holy water, sacred emblems, a silver dagger, and garlic from Leonard. He first placed the dark sacred emblem in front of his chest, then peeled the garlic and tossed its cloves one by one to every corner of the house. This is how garlic is used to dispel ghosts? It's different from the descriptions in the newspapers. Will this work? The townsfolk looking at them broke into discussion, curious and excited, as if they were watching a circus. "It's useless. I'm just acting." Klein suddenly felt that he had become a clown. He closed his eyes and splashed the holy water onto the ground with the silver dagger. He splashed the water as he walked around the house, reciting an incantation, the Evernight Goddess, the Mother of Secrets, the Lady of Crimson, Empress of Disaster and Horror, Mistress of Calm and Silence. These typical acts of a charlatan shocked everyone present as the townsfolk fell silent. And once people turned silent, it was easy for them to notice something they missed. What a warm feeling. It feels like I'm sunbathing. No, I feel like I'm looking at a pure sky. How magical! Is this the effect of the holy water? They sure live up to their names as priests from St. Selena Cathedral. Praise the Lady. The townsfolk discussed in whispers. The looks they gave Klein, Leonard, and Kenley slowly became that of respect. Noah also visibly relaxed, not doubting that the problem had been solved. Sealed artifact 3-0782 is doing all the real work here. We don't actually need to do anything to chase the ghosts away, all we need to do is stay here for a minute. It's not tiring or troublesome at all. After Klein purified the sinister aura off every corner of the house, he opened his eyes and put away his silver dagger, drawing the shape of the crimson moon in front of his chest with a serious expression. "Praise the Lady! Praise the Lady!" the townsfolk replied devoutly. "We still have things to deal with, but we need absolute silence." Leonard smiled as he looked around. The townsfolk, after witnessing something so professional, didn't stay. They receded from Noah's house like a tide following priest sire's lead. Even the master of the house had to leave temporarily. "I actually wanted to take a nap," Noah pouted as he walked toward the cathedral. Leonard took a step forward and closed the door, then turned towards Klein. "Do a divination on the cause of this incident." "No problem." Klein also wanted to find out what he could divine. "I know Mr. Azik did this, but he seems to be of a rather superior nature." A person that can live for 1,300 years must be of a superior nature. So my divinations should definitely be affected. Under such circumstances, without the help of the mysterious space above the gray fog, even I'm not sure what revelations I would receive. Klein took out the pen and paper he brought along with him and wrote down a divination statement, the cause of the haunting at Noah's house. He held the piece of paper and walked to a round table. He then took a seat, closed his eyes, and leaned back. Klein suddenly saw a black mausoleum in his blurred, hazy dream world. It was similar to a pyramid, but stood inverted and was almost fully buried. A black fog obscured everything within the ancient mausoleum. Klein snapped awake and opened his eyes. "Did you find anything?" Kenley asked in concern. Klein thought for a moment and described the revelation he received in his dream without hiding anything. He ended it by saying, "The mausoleum was definitely not in the style of the northern continent, I mean the fifth epoch. I'm somewhat of an expert in this field." Leonard nodded, seemingly in thought. "That's an inverted pyramid from the southern continent. It represents the entering of the nether realm from the living world. It's a mausoleum that only the so-called descendants of death can erect for themselves, be it in the Balam Empire of the past, or its satellite states such as the Highlands Kingdom. In some sense, it's the symbol of death. Well, the ghosts are definitely related to death. The results of the divination are undoubtedly correct." Ignoring Leonard's mockery, Klein suddenly had an interesting thought. Could Mr. Azik be the descendant of death, or could he have made a transaction with death to obtain such a long life? According to a chapter from the Revelation of Evernight, as well as the internal records of the Nighthawks, death was a malevolent god, once causing a catastrophe in the northern continent at the end of the fourth epoch. Those times were now referred to as the Pale Era. It said that death fell to the combined efforts of the seven gods. It's impossible to determine when Lamud Castle was built, but it couldn't have been built before the Pale Era. If there was a connection, then there would be something to investigate regarding the person working behind the scenes, lives in the house with the red chimney, and stole the skull of Mr. Azik's child. Of course, this could be an excuse for the northern continent to colonize the southern continent. After all, most of the inhabitants of the southern continent believes in death. The three Nighthawks didn't stay for long since they didn't discover anything. They soon left Noah's house and started dealing with the two other haunting incidents. The same process, the same results. They quickly rid the town of the auras of dead spirits, but didn't manage to find the cause of all the trouble. Along the way, Leonard asked the townsfolk if any strangers had entered the town in the past few days, but received a negative answer. Mr. Azik didn't come? He must have come and left in secret without anyone noticing him. He sure is cautious. When he said that he would be returning to Tingen by Wednesday, did he mean that these spirits would vanish on their own accord today, even if we weren't here to deal with it? Klein thought about it as he returned to the entrance of Morse Cathedral with Leonard and Kenley. They could still last another hour and 45 minutes with the mutated sun's sacred emblem. We'll take 1 hour shifts looking after the sealed artifact. Klein suppressed the excitement in his heart. He looked at the color of the sky and said, "Let's try to head back to Tingen City for dinner." "No problem." Leonard glanced at Klein and laughed. "But for safety's sake, I suggest that 2 people look after the sealed artifact while one rests." Klein froze for a moment, his mind churning quickly. He smiled in reply. "Sure, but this way we have to calculate the most logical rotation. Who gets to rest first? Who's next? And who will be last? How much time do we need to recover? And by how much? Well, I think that we have to establish an algorithm with an unknown value in order to establish the best way, then compare it with the effectiveness of having one person look over it at a time. It's even better if we can compare the efficiencies too. Let's first assume that the unknown value is weight." Leonard's green eyes were filled with blankness and fear. "If that's the case, let's look after it one at a time. The person looking after it will stay in the cathedral during his shift, as it has a sufficiently large radius. Of course, we'll have to get Priest Sire and the rest to stay somewhere else. The other 2 will stand guard outside the church and prevent others from coming close." I share the same opinion. Kenley had felt a headache coming on as Klein spoke about the mathematical problem. "All right." Klein nodded, looking as though he was forced to do so. If he hadn't been able to convince his partners, then he would have to make a deal with Leonard in secret, giving away some information about himself to get him to leave. But the problem was solved now. Chapter 162. Intense sunlight. Weak light shone through the narrow window from high above, making the interior of Morse Cathedral a little more visible. Klein put his top hat on his knee while he leaned his leg against his cane. He sat quietly on the first row of the left pew and looked at the altar before him. There weren't any statues of the goddess except for a massive dark sacred emblem. Its base was black, with a crimson half-moon that was surrounded by radiant points of light. On the wall behind the sacred emblem, there were a few openings which allowed sunlight to shine in from the outside. They were focused into tiny specks of pure light which combined with the dark surroundings to form a scene that resembled that of a lofty starry night sky. None of the traditional gods ever left behind an actual image. Only their symbols are worshipped and glorified by people. That seems to be a manifestation of the command, do not look directly at God. Klein let his thoughts wander. He wasn't in a hurry to make the flaring sun charms as soon as he got the opportunity to be alone with sealed artifact 3-0782. He felt that he had to be careful, patient, and had to wait. Within the first 15 minutes, it was possible that Leonard and Kenley would enter at any moment to remind him about points that he should take note of. In this extremely quiet atmosphere, time flew by quickly. Klein suddenly snapped back to his senses as he took out his silver vine-leaf pocket watch, flipped it open, and took a glance. 20 minutes have passed, he muttered to himself. He then set his silk top hat and silver-edged black cane by the side. He got up and walked towards a hidden corner near the altar. At first, he faced the side of the altar, but once he saw the large dark sacred emblem and the holy scenery that resembled a depiction of a night sky, he felt guilty and uncomfortable. Hence, he turned his back to the altar. Then, Klein took out the sealed artifact 3-0782 from the inner pocket of his black tuxedo. He bent down to place the golden unadorned badge on the ground. Klein took a look at the sun symbol that was filled with abstract meanings. Then he took out a small candle mixed with sandalwood. He put it right at the bottom of sealed artifact 3-0782. That was the dualistic ritual that he learned from the eternal blazing Sunday. He used an item that was closely related to the deity to represent him, while he used the candle to represent himself. He took a deep breath to ease his tense emotions. Klein then took out the items required for the ritual, one after another, including a carving knife, 2 thin gold slices, sun essential oil extracted from the combination of black-rimmed sunflower, golden-rimmed sunflower and white-rimmed sunflower, golden hand-fingered citron powder, and also rosemary powder. After that, Klein adeptly used the silver ritual dagger to guide the flow of spirituality. He guided it to flow around the simple altar and created a shapeless sealed wall. He squatted down, placed the silver dagger down, and extended his right hand. He lit up the candle that represented himself by rubbing his spirituality. Under the flickering dim light, Klein picked up the sun essential oil and dripped a drop onto the flame. With a puff, an illusory fog spread out with the slight scent of sunlight. After burning the fingered citron and rosemary powder, Klein held the carving knife and golden slices. He stood up, took a step back, and then recited in Hermes, the blood of the eternal blazing Sunday, you are the inextinguishable light, the embodiment of order, the god of deeds, the guardian of businesses. Inextinguishable light, embodiment of order, god of deeds, and guardian of businesses were all parts of eternal blazing sun's honorable titles. If there wasn't the prefix of the blood of the eternal blazing sun, the ritual would require the god's response to proceed. If so, Klein suspected that the eternal blazing sun would recognize him as the disrespectful person that looked at him directly. Then, Leonard and Kenley would only find a pile of black ashes when they entered. Plus, the ritual had to be conducted via ancient Hermes, a ritualistic language that stemmed from nature. Only a language without any protection but had outstanding effects could allow an incantation to sidestep around the eternal blazing sun and point towards the mutated sun's sacred emblem. At the same time, as he was stealing the power from a deity, Klein had no way to divine if it would be successful ahead of time. He felt that it would result in him directly dealing with the deity again. So, he could only recite the rest of the incantation with a strained heart. I pray to you, I pray for you to give me strength to complete the flaring sun charm. The blood of the eternal blazing sun, please transfer your strength into my charm. O fingered citron, a herb that belongs to the sun, please bestow your powers to my charm. As the incantation neared completion, Klein suddenly felt something light up before him. The simple gold badge radiated with an intense light, as though the sun had descended onto the land. Klein suddenly found himself enveloped in extreme heat. His hair was heating up rapidly and was almost on the brink of igniting. His feet felt like they were stepping barefoot on yellow sand that had been exposed to the midday sun, and his face and body were greeted with the hot wind blowing from every direction. In that instance, he felt that he needed to do something to let the burning energies out. Otherwise, he would turn into a human candle. It required almost zero thought as Klein lifted both his hands. While his thoughts were boiling over like porridge, he relied on the combination of his spirituality and the strong winds, as well as his instincts and ritualistic guidance, to begin etching symbols, corresponding path numbers, magical characteristics, and ancient incantations onto both sides of the gold slices with his carving knife. Outside the church, Leonard was standing in the shadows to hide from coming into contact with direct sunlight. Suddenly, the sunlight intensified, like the hottest days of a year in early July. He squinted his eyes and looked towards the sky. He saw that the blue sky had no clouds or dust. It was so pure that it made people gasp with admiration. Such strange weather. Beside him, Kenley also noticed the changes in the sunlight. Leonard responded with a smile when he suddenly turned his head. He knitted his eyebrows slightly and cast his gaze towards the cathedral. Luckily Rose-Anne isn't here. Otherwise, she would be complaining about the sun tanning her skin. Leonard looked away and said with a smile. The blazing sunlight remained intense for a few minutes before it returned to normal. In the cathedral, Klein's carving knife finished the final stroke. As he finished the magical characteristic that represented light, the spirituality on both sides of the gold slices suddenly melded together as the light converged onto the metal. No, this is even closer to godhood. Klein was finally relieved from the boiling and burning sensations. He examined the two flaring sun charms in his hands with a clear mind. The golden luster on the surface of the charms had turned dim, and the pattern looked ancient yet complex. There was a warm, damp feeling that seeped into Klein's skin bit by bit. Not bad. I finally have a more impressive trump card. Klein sighed emotionally. He set the activation incantation for the flaring sun charms as the word lights in ancient Hermes. I want light and there will be light, he quipped, amused. Then he put the flaring sun charms into another pocket. He didn't put them with the slumber, requiem, and dream charms, because the flaring sun charms would decrease their efficacy period. Yes, the power of the flaring sun charms can be maintained for at least a year, or even longer. Klein reined his thoughts back and looked at the mutated sun's sacred emblem on the ground. It didn't look any different on the surface, and it still gave off feelings of warmth and purity. Klein finally relaxed, and quickly completed the ritual and removed the spiritual wall. At that point, he thought to examine himself. He realized that his clothes were almost drenched, and he was covered in sweat. The edges of his hair were slightly curly too. Thankfully, Klein sighed in satisfaction. He put away his things and returned to his original seat. He was so exhausted that he slept the moment he sat down, until he was woken up by footsteps. His eyes shot open, and he touched the flaring sun charms subconsciously to see if they were still there. "You don't look all right?" Leonard asked as he entered the cathedral. Klein massaged his temples, stood up, and smiled. "I'm nearing my limit." He took out his silver pocket watch and took a glance. Just in time. "It's your turn to look after sealed artifact 3-0782. Before he finished speaking, Klein took off the mutated sun's sacred emblem and passed it to Leonard. Leonard watched Klein walk out of the cathedral. Then he dropped his frivolous attitude and examined sealed artifact 3-0782 attentively and seriously. He grew confused and looked bewildered. After the shifts ended, the three Nighthawks began their journey back. Before that, they told Priest Sire to take note of the town's situation. If there were any paranormal incidents, he was to immediately send a telegram to St. Selina Cathedral. At 20 minutes past 7 that night, they finally arrived at Zutland Street and returned sealed artifact 3-0782. When he had made sure that the captain didn't notice anything unusual, Klein left the Blackthorn Security Company and arrived home before 8. He took out his keys and opened the door, only to see an unknown figure. It was obviously a maiden who wasn't even in her 20s. She was in an old, grayish-white dress, and she was wiping the dining hall with all her might. She had black hair and brown eyes. Her eyes were small, her nose wasn't sharp enough, and her facial features were very ordinary. Who's this? Klein was stunned at first, then he realized that she was most likely the maidservant that had come for a trial. At that moment, Benson lowered his newspaper and looked at his brother. He smiled and said, "A company that doesn't allow employees to leave the office on time is annoying. But it provides a salary that can counteract any kind of dissatisfaction," Klein replied with a laugh. "When Miss Justice's £300 reach me, I'll inform Benson and Melissa about my raise to £6 a week. That way they would worry less about our family's finances." Klein thought as he put his cane aside and took off his top hat. He walked to the living hall and lowered his voice as he asked, "Have you made a choice?" He had divined the information of the 3 maidservants the day before, and he had found that all 3 were suitable. Hence, the decision was left to his brother and sister. "Yes, Bella. Weekly salary of 5 solely. She's very willing and also capable of learning cooking. She hopes that she can become a home chef, at which point her weekly pay will double. Her father is a factory worker at the Tingen Steelworks Union Factory, and her mother is a laundry worker," Benson replied with a chuckle. "Of course, another thing that led Melissa and me to the decision is that the other 2 servants believe in the Lord of Storms, and she is a believer of the goddess. I personally don't mind the believers of the Lord of Storms, but Melissa didn't quite like the idea. It wasn't that Melissa didn't like it, a more accurate description would be, I grieve at their misfortune and am infuriated at their refusal to resist. Yes, it was said by Lu Sun." Klein recalled his sister's behavior and revealed a smile. Benson didn't elaborate further. He put down the newspaper and stood up. "Since you're back, let's have dinner." The next day, Klein entered the Blackthorn Security Company in a good mood. "Good morning." Roseanne looked to the left and then the right. Then she said, "Old Neil is sick, let's go and visit him at noon." "What say you?" "Old Neil is sick?" Klein asked in surprise. Could it be that the ritual for treating diarrhea caused severe constipation? Well, from the way he acted after learning of the acting method, it's not impossible for him to suddenly fall sick. He's getting old, so once his mind turns frail, his body would also suffer from those ramifications. Roseanne nodded and said, "Yeah, he sent someone to the captain to request some time off." Klein nodded slightly. "Let's visit him at noon." Sigh, old Neil sure is pitiful. His wife passed away early, and his son is busy in some other city. When he's sick, all he can do is stay at home in loneliness and helplessness. That was the first thing he recalled from his first visit to old Neil's house. Listening to Klein's sigh, Roseanne opened her eyes wide and asked in shock, "When did old Neil get married?" Chapter 163, Various Signs What? Klein was left dumbfounded when he heard Roseanne's question. He recalled in his days, "I previously visited old Neil's place just last month. I saw a piano in the living room and he told me that his deceased wife loved music." As he spoke, Klein suddenly became alarmed as he began having unpleasant thoughts. Roseanne knitted her beautiful brows and said with uncertainty, "Perhaps I remembered wrong. No, Mrs. Oriana and I frequented old Neil's place during the earlier half of the year. There was no piano in his living room back then. I clearly remember asking him why he chose to remain single. His answer was that he hasn't met a lady that he wished to marry, there was no piano during the earlier half of the year, and he answered the question of why he chose to remain single." Klein tightened up and asked in a deep voice, "Roseanne, how long has it been since you visited old Neil's place?" "Not ever since Kenley became a Nighthawk, and Viola chose to resign as a clerk. I've been either burning the midnight oil or catching up on sleep, so how could I have the time to visit him? It's been since the beginning of June." Roseanne became a little lost upon receiving the question, so all she did was answer honestly. Klein's heart sank, as if he sensed something was wrong. He fished out a halfpence from his pocket and held it between his thumb and middle finger. He took a deep breath and quickly decided on a divination statement. "There's something wrong with old Neil's current situation. There's something wrong with old Neil's current situation." His pupils quickly darkened as he recited the statement silently and entered cogitation. Ding! He flicked his thumb, pushing the brass coin into the air and allowing it to spin. The coin fell right into Klein's open palm. This time, the portrait of George III was facing up. The portrait signified that it was correct, that it was positive. That meant that there really was something wrong with old Neil's current situation. As Klein clenched the coin, he suddenly remembered the translucent pair of cold and ruthless eyes without any brows that he had seen behind old Neil when he had just become a beyonder and was experimenting with his spirit vision. Old Neil had explained that the pair of eyes was a characteristic of ritualistic magic. That's right, I also saw an almost formless human figure by the door at the periphery of the light. The color of its aura was identical to the surrounding darkness. Also, after I completely digested the seer potion, I secretly changed the way I activated my spirit vision to the tapping of my left molar. I happened to look at old Neil and he suddenly coughed violently. Scene after scene appeared in Klein's mind, turning his expression grim. Rose and looked at him and asked in fear, "Did old Neil lose control?" "No way, even though he's petty and stingy, and wants to be reimbursed for all of his expenses, he's still a good person. He rarely gets angry. No way, he wouldn't lose control. I cannot be sure, but I think that old Neil is on the brink of losing control." Klein consoled Rosen. He quickly made his way past the partition and opened the door to the captain's office. Dunn Smith was startled by the sudden intrusion, nearly choking on his coffee. What happened? He didn't blame Klein, his expression instantly becoming stern. Klein answered simply without hiding anything. "Captain, my divination tells me that there's something wrong with old Neil. Last month, old Neil told me that his late wife loved music, but today, Rose and told me that he's remained single all this time. Also, on the day that I became a beyonder, I saw a pair of mysterious eyes looking over everything behind old Neil. There was also an almost transparent human figure near the door spying on us. He told me that those were characteristics of ritualistic magic. I felt that something was off and, thus, attempted a divination." After Dunn finished listening intently, he stood up immediately. As he walked over to the coat rack, he asked in puzzlement, "Why didn't you directly divine if old Neil had lost control? Over the past month, old Neil hasn't acted any differently from ordinary beyonders. He even worked with me to help Swain deal with a mandated punisher who had lost control. I've also observed the colors of his aura from time to time and noticed that he's relatively healthy other than his frailty that's due to his age. Thus, I think that he's only close to losing control. He could still be saved." Klein explained his point of view in one breath. Dunn put on his black hat and windbreaker before nodding. "A very reasonable deduction. Let's go pay a visit to old Neil now, and try not to agitate him if possible. After that, we can attempt to control him and use ritualistic magic to stabilize his condition to prevent it from getting worse." Control. Klein had an idea when he heard this term. "Captain, could we use sealed artifact 3-0611? He had been thinking about how he could resolve old Neil's problem and save him, but he hadn't arrived at an answer as he had been too flustered, too uneasy, and too worried. He was reminded by Dunn Smith's words and recalled that the sealed artifact might be useful. Number 0611. Name, Peaceful Hair Strands. Danger grade, 3, considerably dangerous. It has to be used carefully. It can only be applied for operations that require 3 or more people. Security classification, official Nighthawk member or above. Sealing method, no direct contact with living organisms. Description, a simple decoration formed with many strands of black hair. As long as contact is made with a living being without any protection, the living being would lose all their desires and emotions, including, but not limited to, hunger, anger, grief, pain, envy, jealousy, hate, joy, satisfaction, greed, etc. It has been ascertained that living beings under 0611's influence will even lose the desire to break contact with it. They will silently stay in their spot until the end of their life. If an external force is used to break contact between the person and 0611, then the person will gradually recover. But experimental data suggests that the prerequisite to this is that the person has not been in contact with the sealed artifact for more than 2 hours. Once the contact lasts for more than 2 hours, the victim would become silent for eternity. The highest sequence tested is sequence 5. You can avoid contact by means such as wearing gloves. The strands of hair aren't equipped with the capability to live. It doesn't have any inclinations of escaping the seal. Appendix: these strands of hair appeared during a failed advancement. It was something left behind when a captain of the Nighthawks failed to advance to sequence 6. The great-eyed Dunn nodded after he heard Klein. Great suggestion. I nearly forgot about 3-0611. Find Royale in the recreation room. I'll retrieve the sealed artifact from Cheney's Gate and submit the application after we come back. That's the way, no time to waste. Klein didn't dawdle. He immediately went to the recreation room and shouted for the usually expressionless sleepless Royale. What's the mission? Royale asked calmly. Klein exhaled and said in a serious tone, Pay old Neil a visit. Pay old Neil a visit, Royale opened her eyes wide as she had an ominous feeling. It's not confirmed yet? Klein shook his head gently. Royale didn't speak any further. They slipped into silence, turning the mood heavy. A few minutes passed, and Dunn finally returned from the basement. He was wearing black gloves and had a tangled mess of black hair in his hand. Compared to the mutated sun's sacred emblem, the peaceful hair strands didn't look particularly weird. It would be glossed over by people if it were tossed on the road somewhere. After calling for the chauffeur Cesare, the four of them made their way to old Neil's house. The wheels of the carriage rolled across the asphalt road that was wet from the rain. The carriage interior was more silent than the night. It was unknown how much time had passed until Dunn sighed. Old Neil did have a partner that he was about to be engaged with when he was younger, but she suddenly became terminally ill. Old Neil risked divulging the secrets of the Beyonders and tried using ritualistic magic to save her, but he didn't succeed. Old Neil back then was just a beginner in mysticism. According to the records, the Nighthawks back then were all on alert, afraid that old Neil would lose control because of this. But luckily, he managed to find his sanity and looked normal. Let's hope that this is a false alarm as well. Klein couldn't help but draw a crimson moon before his chest and prayed, May the goddess watch over him. Dunn and Royale followed suit. May the goddess watch over him. The sky started to turn brighter as the dark clouds receded. The Nighthawks arrived in front of old Neil's bungalow. After getting Cesare to drive the carriage far away, Dunn collected himself and walked towards the main door, cane in one hand and sealed artifact 3-0611 in the other. Klein pressed down his hat as he and Royale followed behind the captain. They made their way past the rose and gold mint garden. When they reached the door, Klein took a step forward and pulled on the rope connected to the bell within the building. Clink, clink. A pleasant chime resounded in the house as it broke the heavy silence. Clink, 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 clink. Klein pulled several times, then politely took a step back without making any further attempts. The three Nighthawks waited patiently for a few minutes, but they didn't hear any footsteps approaching the door. Perhaps old Neil went to visit a doctor and isn't at home. Klein forced a smile. He hadn't finished his sentence when a melody came from within the building. It was the music from a piano. It was like a silent lake veiled by a thin mist beneath the moonlight. Dunn's expression became abnormally stern and grave. Klein's heart sank as well. Just as he was about to do another divination, he suddenly saw liquid flowing out from the gap beneath the door. The stream of liquid was transparent and pure at first, before it became dyed crimson, a crimson similar to that of blood. It was an intensely dark crimson red. Chapter 164. Miserable wretches. The color of fresh blood was reflected in Klein's eyes as they intently locked onto the flowing liquid. Just then, there was a light cough from within the house. Old Neil spoke with a raspy voice. Dunn, why are you here? Dunn's gray eyes were extremely deep. His mellow voice replied calmly, I heard that you're sick, so we came to visit. There was a sudden silence in the house. A few seconds later, old Neil roared in anger and terror, No, you're lying. Without waiting for Klein and company to say a word, his tone suddenly became weak. Yes, I know my condition isn't quite right. Klein closed his eyes, but the bloody liquid that was seeping through the gap of the door didn't cease. Then, old Neil raised his voice and said, "All this time, I've never hurt anyone, nor have I thought of hurting anyone. I never betrayed the secrets of the Nighthawks, even one. At the most, I've made claims for undeserving expenses. I really haven't committed any evil." Klein, he suddenly shouted like he usually did. "I told you about the maxim of the mystery priors, do as you wish, but do no harm. I still live by this saying. I'd rather be patient, I'd rather endure than do things that will harm others." With that said, he pleaded sincerely in fear, "Done, Klein, go back. Go back. Wait till tomorrow, by tomorrow, I'll be back to normal. I swear to the goddess, I wouldn't harm anyone. Really?" Dunn closed his eyes and asked extremely gently, "What do you plan on doing? What have you been trying to do all this while?" "Me?" Old Neil was confused at first before he described with a tone filled with hope, "I'm trying to resurrect Celeste. Dunn, I found a way, I'm on the right track. You should have heard about it. Back then, I made a mistake during the ritualistic magic to treat her illness, so I failed. I failed to save her. I now know it was because I had yet to master mysticism. But now, I have enough knowledge and experience to complete everything. It's regrettable that I wasn't inspired by the maxim of the mystery priors and Daly's example. I missed the best opportunity. If I was a high-sequence beyonder, all of this would become extremely easy." As he spoke, old Neil's voice sounded tearful. "No, I cannot give up again. Don't go back. Go back, please. I beg of you." Klein clenched his teeth as he heard the captain ask emotionally, "How do you plan on resurrecting Celeste?" Old Neil instantly became very excited. "I'll use the alchemical life's method to create an immortal body for her. Dunn, you might not know of it, but Sequence 4 Beyonders from the Church of Mother Earth are good at this. The corresponding sequence in the Savant pathway can barely do it as well. Yes, I will complete it with the aid of God's favor. Then, I'll summon her spirit from the spirit world and pray for God's help to combine her spirit and body together. Isn't it a great idea?" Dunn lifted the corner of his lips forcefully and said, "Yes, it's a great idea. Neil, let us in. Perhaps we can help you." "Dunn, are you still not willing to let me off the hook?" Old Neil pleaded, "Go back, just go back. I'll return to normal tomorrow, really. Dunn, I swear I'll never steal your coffee beans again. Klein, well, I swear I won't make you help me with my undeserved claims. Really?" In Klein's and Royale's blurry vision, Dunn lowered his head before lifting it up again. "Old Neil, you're misunderstanding. We're here to visit you. You are our teammate. You're sick and you aren't well. We definitely needed to visit you. Open the door. Let us see you so that we can be certain. If you're really okay, we'll return immediately. As you know, there are especially many missions recently. We have to monitor the asylum while we take care of various other sudden incidents." Old Neil hesitated for a moment before saying, "There's really nothing serious about my condition, really. I'll recover by tomorrow." The bloody water that flowed out through the gap under the door went down the stairs, towards the stone path, and onto the garden's soil. "Old Neil, we've known each other for about 15 years now, right? We've worked on countless missions together. I'm really concerned and worried for you. I have to see you with my own eyes before I'll be at ease," Dunn said gently. "All right," Old Neil pouted. "There's really nothing wrong with me." With a creak, the door opened slowly. Klein quickly wiped his eyes and allowed his sight to return to normal. Then he saw that the carpet in the lobby was red and sticky, covered in blood and hair. He looked forward and up, only to realize that the living room's floor, ceiling, round table, piano, and chairs were all covered in the same disgusting, sticky and hairy liquid. Old Neil's head hung in the air, connected to the ceiling by a thick liquid. His forehead and cheeks each had a pair of eyes. They were cold and ruthless eyes with no eyelashes. The piano's keys were dancing on their own, playing a melodious tune. "Don, look, I'm really okay," Old Neil said with a radiant smile. "Roy, Klein, you think so too, right?" The moment he opened his mouth, Klein saw the same thick, hairy, and bloody liquid flowing inside it. Dunn's gray eyes shimmered as he chatted like everything was normal. "Old Neil, where did you learn the alchemical life and resurrection ritual from?" Old Neil replied excitedly, "I heard it. I tried the first part, and confirmed its authenticity. It's a gift from God. He kept describing it in my ears. He kept describing he is. Old Neil's voice came to a halt. More than 10 seconds later, he continued in fear and in apparent loss. He is the hidden sage, the hidden sage. Isn't that the non-anthropomorphic God that the Moses ascetic order believes in? The God that was resurrected, bringing about evil and corruption. The Moses ascetic order has the complete mystery prior sequence. Klein's heart stirred as many thoughts came to him. Upon mentioning the hidden sage, old Neil seemed to finally awaken. He looked around vacantly and observed everything. In the indescribable silence, his 6 eyes looked towards Dunn, and he said with a bitter smile, "So it turns out that I've already become a monster." Without waiting for Dunn and the others to reply, old Neil suddenly revealed a smile, one of groveling, fear, and cowardice. "Let me go. I'll go deep into the mountains and won't appear again. I'll never harm anyone. I'll only attempt my ritual quietly, really. Let me go, please. I beg of you." Just then, Klein felt something illusory shatter before his eyes. Then, old Neil's 4 cold-looking lashless eyes flashed with a dark glow and locked onto Dunn. His expression suddenly turned cold. "You're pulling me into a dream." "No, it's useless. My eyes can see through all of that." The sticky blood that covered the ceiling, floor, and walls started squirming, like a giant opening its mouth to swallow Klein and company. Old Neil's head grew blurry like overlapping afterimages. Klein didn't fumble for his revolver. Instead, he extended his hand into his pocket and planned to use his slumber charm. Suddenly, everything calmed down before him. The sticky, bloody liquid suddenly turned placid like a still lake. Old Neil lost his coldness, hatred, desire, and all other expressions. He became quiet and peaceful. It was unknown when Dunn had thrown sealed artifact 3-0611 into the blood. The 4 lashless eyes on old Neil's forehead and cheeks slowly closed, seemingly having lost the desire to keep them open. Any living creature that came into contact with the peaceful hair strands would turn peaceful and lose all motivation until the end of their life. Dunn, Klein, and Royal drew their guns at the same time and aimed at old Neil's head. Then, old Neil revealed a look of extreme fear. He was struggling. His strong desire to live fought against the effects of sealed artifact 3-0611. The 4 extra eyes disappeared. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes and mouth were still deep, his hair was still white, his crimson eyes were still turbid, just like when Klein had first met him. "Dunn, do you remember the time I saved you? Royale, do you remember when I helped you redeem your family's lives? Klein, do you remember how I taught you mysticism every day? Do you remember when we talked about how to make claims? Do you remember how I made you hand-ground coffee? Do you remember when we fought against a mandated Punisher rampager?" The illusory pleading echoed in Klein's ears, and his right hand that was holding the revolver trembled. He found it difficult to pull the trigger. Bang! Bang! The 2 silver demon-hunting bullets flew out and penetrated old Neil's head one after another. Klein watched as the familiar, abnormal face revealed a hopeless expression. He saw the man's skull tear open, the red and white within spurting in all directions. The sticky blood that coated their surroundings started shrinking as it flowed back into old Neil's broken head that had fallen to the ground. Dunn and Royal lowered their guns simultaneously, and all was silent. Klein looked at everything before him. Old Neil's corpse was becoming a ball of rotten flesh. He saw that there was a pair of eyes, crimson and crystal clear, yet incredibly pained amidst the blood and flesh. He felt like everything that had happened was just a dream and found it impossible to bring himself into believing the sequence of events and how it had ended. He stood dumbfounded as he saw Dunn take 2 steps forward, his figure stooped. Dunn looked at old Neil's corpse and muttered heavily, "We are guardians, but also a bunch of miserable wretches that are constantly fighting against threats and madness." Chapter 165. Epitaph, we are guardians, but also a bunch of miserable wretches that are constantly fighting against threats and madness. Dunn's words echoed throughout old Neil's house. They reverberated across the corroded floor, the walls, and ceiling, as well as within Klein's mind and soul. He'd never had a stronger impression of that sentence than the one he had now. He felt that he wouldn't forget this feeling for as long as he lived, even if he were to return to Earth. Amidst the still atmosphere, Dunn walked towards old Neil's corpse and kneeled down. He took out a white handkerchief from the pocket of his windbreaker and covered it over the dark red, crystalline eyeball which looked pained. At this moment, Klein noticed that the keys of the piano had stopped moving. A faint, translucent figure appeared. Klein, who had activated his spirit vision before entering the house, froze. He hadn't noticed this strange soul until now. Was it because he was distracted by old Neil, or was it due to old Neil's abilities after he lost control? Klein saw the formless figure evaporate quickly, vanishing before his very eyes. He had a faint idea of what was going on. Suppressing the heavy feeling in his heart, he heard the captain order, "Search old Neil's house carefully for possible clues." "All right." When Klein spoke, it took him a minute to recognize his own voice. His voice was raspy and deep, as if he had the flu. "All right," Royal also replied. "The condition of her voice is about the same as mine. It's like our nostrils are blocked." Klein looked at his female teammate, who typically didn't have much of an expression. It was as if he was knowing her for the first time. Placing his cane on an umbrella rack near the door, he made his way around sealed artifact 3-0611. He took heavy steps into the living room and up to the second floor. He then searched every room for possible clues. Old Neil employed someone to clean the rooms regularly, so the rooms weren't as messy as one would expect of a bachelor. Everything was in order, as if there was a female presence in the house. Half an hour later, Klein found a few handwritten notes on a bookshelf in old Neil's room. The notes recorded a weird, mysterious ritual, alchemical life. The materials required include 100 milliliters of spring water from the Spring of Elves, Golden Spring on Sonia Island, 50 grams of star crystal, half a pound of pure gold, 5 grams of phlogiston, 30 grams of red iron, and a large quantity of fresh blood from living people. Old Neil annotated beneath the part about fresh blood from the living. "I can consider drawing my own blood, accumulating it little by little and preserve it using ritualistic magic. I can consider drawing my own." Klein closed his eyes and crushed the notes. On Thursday morning at 9, the time of the moon. Raphael Cemetery. Klein was wearing his black formal suit and holding onto his cane. He stood silently in a corner of the cemetery. He had stuffed a neat white handkerchief in his breast pocket and was holding onto a slumber flower. Dunn, Fry, Leonard, and Kenley were carrying a black coffin that stored old Neil's corpse. They slowly walked to the front of the tombstone and silently lowered it into the grave. As she saw the brown soil being tossed into the grave, Rosen, who was wearing a black dress and a white flower in her hair, wept. "Can someone tell me if this is all happening for Rayal? Why did he lose control? Why did he consume the potion? Why did he become a beyonder? Why must there be wraiths and monsters? Why is there no safer way? Why? Klein silently listened on until old Neil's coffin was completely buried in the soil, until all signs that he existed were buried deep within the earth. "May the goddess bless you." He drew a crimson moon in front of his chest, then took a few steps forward and placed the slumber flower in front of the tomb. "May the goddess bless you." Dunn, Fry, and the others tapped at their chests in a clockwise fashion. Klein looked up, straightened his back, and saw the black and white photograph on the tombstone. Old Neil was wearing his classic black hat. His white hair was peeking out around the edges. The wrinkles beside his eyes and mouth were deep, his dark red eyes a little turbid. He was so peaceful, no longer feeling grief, pain, or fear. There was an epitaph carved underneath the photograph. It came from the contents of the last entry in old Neil's diary. "If I cannot save her, then I shall accompany her." The morning breeze blew gently. The silence and emptiness of the Raphael Cemetery hung over everyone. In the afternoon, Klein took a form signed by the captain to the armory. He opened the half-closed door and saw Brett with a thick, black beard behind the table. Klein froze visibly before handing the form over. 50 rounds of ordinary bullets? During his request, he glanced at the tin can on the table. He felt as though he could smell the fragrance of the hand-ground coffee and hear the cheeky words in his ears, "But why must you wait till you have spare cash? You can apply to Dunn and get him to approve of the expenses." Brett noticed Klein's expression and sighed. "I can understand what you're feeling right now. I, myself, cannot believe that old Neil would leave us like that. Sometimes, I even feel as though this is a dream conjured by the captain." "Perhaps this is the destiny of many Nighthawks," Klein replied with a bitter smile. After this incident, he felt much more disappointment and hatred toward the upper echelons of the church for keeping this acting method a secret. "Let's hope that there will be fewer such tragedies. May the goddess bless us." Brett drew a crimson moon in front of his chest. He took the application form and walked into the armory. Bang, bang, bang. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Klein vented his frustrations onto the target he was shooting at until he finished shooting the bullets that he had requested. He then collected himself and took a public carriage to Gawain's house. He completed sets upon sets of exercises, as if he was torturing himself, until Gawain told him to stop. "Combat practice isn't there for you to harm yourself." Gawain looked at Klein with his turbid green eyes. "I'm sorry, teacher. I'm a little down today." Klein exhaled and attempted to explain. "What happened?" Gawain asked without a ripple of emotion. Klein thought for a moment, then gave a simple reply. "A friend of mine passed away suddenly." Gawain was silent for a few seconds. He stroked his blonde mustache and said with a fleeting voice, "I once lost 325 friends in the span of 5 minutes. Amongst them were 10 that I could trust with my life." Klein sighed in realization. "That is the cruelty of war." Gawain shot a glance at him and let out a self-deprecating laugh. "The cruelest thing of all is the fact that I can never exact revenge for them. I can never fulfill their dreams, and the answer eludes me forever. As for you, you still have such a chance. Even though I don't exactly know what happened, I know that you're still young. You still have many opportunities." Klein was silent for a moment. He took in a breath and collected himself. "Thank you, teacher." Gawain nodded and said without any expression, "Take a 10-minute break, then do 10 more sets of the exercises you were doing just now." Klein was momentarily unsure what expression he should show. Friday morning, in the recreation room of the Nighthawks. Klein, Sika Tron, and Fry were seated around the round table, but they weren't playing cards. One of them was flipping through newspapers, the other was looking out the oriel windows in a daze, and the last was holding onto a pen, wanting to write something but failing to do so. The room was quiet. No one spoke, and no one joked around. The atmosphere was heavy. Phew. Klein exhaled. He lowered his newspaper and planned to focus on reading the materials he had found. At that moment, Dunn Smith knocked and entered the room. He looked around before saying, "Klein, come out for a moment." "What happened?" Klein, who had a premonition of what was happening, stood up and made his way out of the recreation room. Dunn stood at the entrance of the stairway leading to the basement. He turned and looked at Klein. "The person that the Holy Cathedral sent is here. The person examining me is here?" Klein's nerves tensed. Chapter 166. Examination. There was a cold breeze blowing from the basement, providing a hint of relief for Klein's tense emotions. "It's finally here. Once I pass the stage, I won't have to worry about being examined like this for at least half a year. Once I advance to Sequence 8 and become a so-called clown, I'll possess actual combat strength. With the aid of divination and my flaring sun charms for backup, I'll have a chance of surviving even more relatively dangerous situations. Since I was waiting for the Holy Cathedral's examination, I haven't even dared to withdraw the £300 that Miss Justice transferred to the anonymous account. Just in case they audit my financial situation and find out that I'm in possession of a large sum of money from an unknown source." Just as Klein's thoughts flashed through his mind uncontrollably, Dunn Smith smoothed his sleeve and said in a low voice, "The person in charge of the examination is one of the 9 high-ranking deacons of the Nighthawks, Crestet Casimir. The Holy Cathedral attaches great importance to you. A high-ranking deacon? Klein blurted in surprise. In general terms, the 13 archbishops and 9 high-ranking deacons made up the upper echelons of the church. It was said that there was no lack of high-sequence beyonders among them. The 22 ladies and gentlemen were all equal in terms of their rankings. They only followed the orders of the Evernight goddess, and they were only answerable to the Pope. Dunn took a whiff of the cold wind from the basement before nodding faintly. Yes, he's a high-ranking deacon. But you don't have to be nervous. Crestet is only a sequence 5, and has yet to enter a demigod state. So, you don't have to be too afraid or reverent. Oh, his title in the Beyonder world is the goddess's sword. As he possesses a holy item, his combat strength is similar to a newly advanced sequence 4 Beyonder. I just chatted with him. He was very friendly. If I read between the lines, Captain is telling me that he only said what was necessary. He doesn't want me to be nervous and go according to the plan. Klein nodded thoughtfully and asked, "Where should I meet the high-ranking deacon?" "The alchemy room where we concoct potions," Dunn replied simply, as a hint of gloominess flashed across his face. "The alchemy room where we concoct potions? The laboratory where old Neil made my seer potion?" Klein slowly let out a breath and returned to the Nighthawk's recreation room and took his outerwear from the clothes rack. He put on the black windbreaker, placed his hands into his pockets, and walked down the winding stairs that connected to the basement. Then, he took a left turn at the cross junction. Very quickly, Klein saw a secret door under the light of the elegant gas lamps that lined the walls. He saw that the long tables in the room had been moved aside to open up a large space in the center of the room. There were 2 classic high-back chairs facing each other with less than a meter in between them. There was a man in his 30s wearing a black windbreaker and a white shirt seated on the chair that was facing the door. His golden brown hair was cut very short, and his blackish-green eyes were as dark as a forest on a moonless night. The collars of his shirt and windbreaker were put up, and his entire chin was hidden within the shadows. "Hello, Your Grace." Klein bowed. Crestet Casimir had his right leg crossed over his left as he leisurely leaned back into his chair. He smiled and replied, "Hello, Klein. You may sit over there." He pointed at the high back chair opposite him. By the side of his leg was a suitcase made of silver. It was about the size of a violin case. It can carry a sword with an appropriate length. Klein walked forward and sat at his appointed seat. Crestet rested his right index finger on his upper lip as he thought for a few seconds. "I plan to first examine how well you've mastered your potion. That's not a problem, right?" "Not at all." Klein shook his head with utmost confidence. "Very confident." Crestet smiled but maintained his previous posture. All he did was intently watch Klein. Klein suddenly felt the light from the surrounding gas lamps vanish, as though they were swallowed by the rich darkness. He suddenly became exhausted, as though his biological clock had struck the time for sleep. But his mind was extremely tense, making it impossible to relax. It was just like when he was unable to sleep peacefully due to overexhaustion. The silent night filled his surroundings as Klein heard the noise of dripping water from a tap that wasn't closed properly. Then, he heard the conversations in the Blackthorn Security Company and the movement of the wind blowing through the stairway. Besides that, he didn't see anything that he shouldn't see, nor did he hear any noises that he shouldn't be able to hear. "Excellent." Crestet's hypnotic voice dispersed the darkness, and the light from the gas lamps inside and outside the alchemy room came into Klein's sight again. Klein suddenly shook off his exhaustion and returned to his previous energetic self. "He affected me without me realizing it. Is that what a Sequence 5 Beyonder is capable of? This is the horror of a high-ranking deacon?" He recalled what had happened and felt a little frightened. Crestet Casimir clasped his hands and put them on his knees. He bent down slightly, and his lips were blocked by his collar. "You passed the test. You achieved a level beyond outstanding in your mastery of your potion. I'll need to observe to see if there are any hidden dangers in your mind, to make sure that the potion's remaining spirit hasn't changed your character subconsciously or left some problems behind. You have 3 minutes to prepare." Klein immediately nodded and said, "All right." He secretly took a breath and allowed himself to enter cogitation to remove various negative thoughts. Crestet didn't speak again. He took out a silver pocket watch from the inner pocket of his black windbreaker and flipped it open. Then he attentively watched the second hand move. 3 minutes later, Crestet closed his pocket watch and said with a smile, "I'll begin singing." "Singing?" Klein wore a look of confusion. Before Klein could reply, Crestet started humming a lovely melody. The melody reverberated in the alchemy room and gradually lost its harmony and went out of tune. Sweet, scratch, zing. Klein heard the noise akin to the scratching of blackboards with nails, the sound of bubble wrap rubbing against each other, electric drills drilling, and various other annoying noises. The noises intensified and turned more and more chaotic. They made him want to vent his frustrations and cause destruction. But Klein, who frequently experienced the mad ravings and terrifying screams, restrained his urges very quickly. He displayed annoyance, tension, frustration, and insecurity at appropriate times. Being in too perfect of a state would end up being a problem. It was unknown when Crestet Sesamir had stopped singing. The noises in the alchemy room disappeared and room was awash with tranquility and silence. "Silence sure is great," Klein exclaimed in his head. "Very good, excellent. There are no latent problems in your soul. Of course, if you wanted to beat me up or stuff my mouth with something, that's only normal." Crestet's mouth was blocked by his collar, so Klein could only determine his emotions through his tone. "No, I wouldn't dare," Klein admitted honestly. Crestet smiled and said, "Congratulations, you have passed all the tests. Now it's time for the question and answer session." His green eyes suddenly darkened. His gaze was deep as though he could see through flesh, and looked directly at the spirit. "Go ahead," Klein replied, sitting straight. Crestet maintained his earlier posture and casually asked, "You said that your experience in the divination club allowed you to quickly master the potion?" "Yes," Klein answered frankly but didn't describe further. Crestet nodded slightly and said, "And you said that your inspiration came from the maxim of the mystery priors and also Daly's example?" "Yes." Klein confirmed this first before explaining in detail. "I found out from one of my teammates who was a mystery prior that those who abide by the maxim of the mystery priors have a lower probability of losing control than normal. After that, I heard that Madame Daly once said that she wanted to be a real spirit medium, and that she is a genius that leveled up to sequence 7 within 2 years. After noticing both situations, I thought I could give it a try. I attempted to be a real seer and outlined some principles for a seer. The outcome was better than I expected. I mastered the potion very quickly." "Your Grace, I'm not sure if you have had a similar experience. When I fully mastered the potion, there was a very special, very magical feeling." Klein described his experience as if he only vaguely understood the acting method. The man he had been when he was on Earth would have been nervous and embarrassed to speak so many half-lies before such a powerful Nighthawk. But ever since he transmigrated to the current world, he had lied so much that he was used to it. He could do it flawlessly. The darkness in Crestet's eyes disappeared, and his gaze returned to normal. He smiled and said, "Don't worry, it's not an illusion." From his answer, Klein couldn't see any doubt or scrutiny, so he felt at ease. Dunn endorsed your experience. "I believe that you really are a genius, with a logical mind and sharp senses," Crestet complimented. He then asked, "Did you share your experience with your teammates?" "Of course," Klein admitted frankly. "I hope that I can help them lower the risk of losing control. We're teammates, comrades that face danger together. I don't have any reason to hide the truth. But for the same reason, I didn't tell the clerks." Crestet uncrossed his right leg and sat up straight. His thin lips were exposed from the shadow of his collar. He lifted the corner of his lips and said, "Although you haven't even been with the Nighthawks for 2 months, I believe your understanding towards partners is much better than many others. I plan to share more information with you, but according to the Holy Cathedral's rules, you have to swear to the goddess that you won't reveal the contents of our conversation to anyone that doesn't know about this. That should be fine, right? I passed the test?" Klein was delighted. He nodded without hesitation. "No problem. Although I won't be able to teach others that acting method, I can let Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man do so indirectly." You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.